Hello everyone and welcome back to Horror Helm. Now I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off I thought it would be a fun idea if everyone can leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also, like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes, and if you're enjoying the content, feel free to show your support by sending a super thanks. Your support helps keep the channel going and brings more chilling stories your way. I grew up in a small rural town nestled between dense forests and rolling hills. Everyone in our town believed in some kind of superstition about the woods, but I always brushed it off as old wives' tales. I was 18 at the time, confident and brash, believing nothing could scare me. It was late November and I had stayed at my friend Mark's house playing video games. Time slipped by faster than I thought, and before I knew it, it was past 11 p.m. I didn't have a car back then, so walking home was my only option. Normally, the thought of walking through the forest trail alone at night didn't bother me. It was the quickest route to my house, cutting a 15-minute walk down to 10. Mark had offered to let me crash at his place, but I refused. "Come on, it's just trees," I said, laughing. Mark didn't laugh back. Instead, he looked me dead in the eye and said, "Don't stop if you hear something." I rolled my eyes and shrugged it off. "Sure thing, buddy," I said, waving as I stepped out into the chilly night air. The forest trail started just a few streets away from Mark's house. By the time I reached it, the wind had picked up, and the trees swayed and groaned in the darkness. My phone's flashlight was my only source of light, slicing through the oppressive blackness ahead of me. The first 10 minutes were uneventful, just the crunch of my boots against the frost-covered path and the occasional rustle of leaves. I kept thinking about Mark's strange warning. He wasn't usually superstitious, but something about his tone that night had been off. About halfway through the trail, I started hearing it. At first it was faint, like the sound of someone whispering just out of earshot. I stopped walking and shined my flashlight around, but there was nothing but trees and shadows. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing slightly. The whispering stopped. I stood there for a moment, heart pounding, listening to the forest's silence. It wasn't an animal or the wind. This had sounded human. Still, I convinced myself it was my imagination playing tricks on me. After all, Mark's creepy warning had probably gotten into my head. I kept walking, but the whispers came back. This time they were louder and seemed to be coming from multiple directions. They didn't sound like words, just incoherent murmuring like a conversation I couldn't quite catch. "Who's there?" I yelled, spinning around, shining my light on the trees. My voice cracked, betraying my fear. Silence again. I started walking faster, trying to shake the growing unease crawling up my spine. The whispers started again, but now they were closer. I broke into a jog, my breath visible in the cold air, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly ahead of me. That's when I saw it. Standing on the path about 20 feet ahead was a figure. It was tall and thin, almost unnaturally so, and its face was obscured by the shadows. My flashlight flickered as I aimed it at the figure, and for a moment I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. "Hey, what do you want?" I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, staring, or at least I think it was staring. I took a step back and the figure took a step forward. Its movements were slow and deliberate, like it knew exactly how much it was terrifying me. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs felt frozen in place. Then it spoke. "Why are you here?" The voice was hollow and raspy, like it hadn't been used in years. The words didn't make sense to me. This was a public trail. People used it all the time. "I'm just trying to get home," I stammered, my voice barely audible. The figure tilted its head almost as if it were curious. "Home? You don't belong here." That was enough for me. I turned and bolted back the way I came, not caring about how much longer it would take to get home by the road. The whispers erupted around me again, louder and more chaotic, as if the forest itself was alive and angry. I could hear footsteps behind me, heavy and deliberate, but I didn't dare look back. The trail seemed longer than I remembered, and no matter how fast I ran, the footsteps stayed right behind me. My flashlight flickered and then went out completely, plunging me into total darkness. I could barely see the path, relying on muscle memory and sheer panic to guide me. Finally, I burst out of the woods and onto the street. The whispers stopped. The footsteps stopped. I turned around, gasping for air, but the forest was silent and still. No figure, no sound, nothing. I didn't stop running until I reached my house. Once inside, I locked every door and window, not caring how ridiculous I looked. My parents were asleep, and I didn't want to wake them, so I went straight to my room and collapsed onto my bed, shaking. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figure's shadowy form, heard its raspy voice. "You don't belong here." The next day I told Mark what had happened. His face went pale and he nodded grimly. "I told you not to stop," he said. When I pressed him for details, he hesitated before finally telling me the story. Apparently, years ago, a man had gone missing on that very trail. Search parties combed the woods for weeks, but they never found him. Some people believed he had gotten lost and died of exposure, while others claimed he had been taken by something else. Whatever the truth was, locals had reported strange sightings and sounds on the trail ever since. I never took that path again. To this day, I can't explain what I saw or heard that night, but I know one thing for sure. Whatever was in those woods, it wasn't human, wasn't. I had just started my first year at college and was thrilled to move into my dorm. It wasn't exactly modern, but it had character. A sturdy old building made of brick, sitting on the edge of campus. The dorm was built back in the 1930s, and though it had been renovated a few times, there was still something eerie about its creaking floors and drafty hallways. I got lucky and was assigned a single room on the 4th floor. It was cozy, and I was happy to have some privacy, but it didn't take long for the isolation to start weighing on me. Most of my floor stayed empty because the university had overbuilt new housing elsewhere on campus. That meant the halls were often quiet, almost unnervingly so. One Friday night, I stayed back in the dorm to study while my friends went out partying. By 9 p.m., the building felt deserted. The only sounds were the occasional gust of wind rattling the old windows and the faint hum of the vending machine down the hall. Around 10:30, I decided to grab a snack from the vending machine before calling it a night. I left my room, my footsteps echoing in the silent corridor. As I reached the end of the hallway, I noticed something strange. The door to the janitor's closet, which was usually locked, was slightly ajar. Curiosity got the better of me. I peeked inside, expecting to see cleaning supplies and mops, but instead, I found a staircase leading downward. It was narrow and dimly lit, with old wooden steps that looked like they hadn't been used in years. I should have walked away. Every instinct in me said to close the door and pretend I hadn't seen it. But something about that staircase pulled me in. Maybe it was boredom, or maybe I just wanted to feel brave. But I stepped inside and began descending the creaky steps. The air grew colder the farther down I went, and the faint smell of dampness filled my nose. At the bottom of the stairs was another door, heavy and made of iron. It looked ancient, like it belonged in a dungeon rather than a dormitory. My hand shook as I reached for the rusted handle. The door groaned open, revealing a small, dimly lit room. It wasn't like anything I had expected. The walls were made of rough stone, and the floor was covered in a thin layer of dust. In the center of the room stood a single wooden chair, its back facing me. On the chair was a cracked mirror, propped up as if someone had been sitting there staring at themselves. I hesitated, my pulse quickening. The air felt thick, oppressive, as if the room itself didn't want me there. Just as I turned to leave, I heard it. A faint whisper. "Don't go." I froze. The voice was soft, almost pleading, but it was unmistakable. I whipped around, my eyes scanning the room, but there was no one there. My heart pounded as I slowly backed toward the door, and then the chair moved. It wasn't much, just a slight scrape against the floor, but it was enough to send me sprinting up the stairs. I slammed the janitor's closet door shut behind me and bolted back to my room. locking the door and crawling under my blanket like a child hiding from the monster under the bed. I tried to convince myself that I had imagined it. Maybe it was the wind, or maybe the old dorm's creaks and groans had spooked me. But deep down I knew what I had experienced wasn't normal. The next morning I went to the dorm manager and casually asked about the janitor's closet. She gave me a strange look and said, "There's no staircase in there, it's just storage." I insisted that I had seen it, but she dismissed me with a wave of her hand. "You must have been mistaken. Maybe it was the basement entrance near the laundry room." But I wasn't mistaken. I knew what I had seen. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the chair, the mirror, and the voice. At some point, exhaustion must have overtaken me because I woke up to the sound of knocking. It was faint but deliberate, coming from my door. I checked my phone. It was 2:47 a.m. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. No answer. The knocking came again, louder this time. My heart raced as I approached the door, peering through the peephole. There was no one there. I stood frozen for a moment, debating whether to open the door. Finally, I gathered my courage, unlocked it, and swung it open. The hallway was empty. I closed the door, locking it again, and turned to go back to bed. That's when I saw it. On my desk, scrawled into the thin layer of dust, was a single word: mirror. My stomach dropped. I didn't own a mirror, and I hadn't touched my desk since cleaning it the day before. My hands trembled as I wiped the word away, trying to convince myself it was some sort of prank. Maybe one of my friends had written it before I moved in and I had just now noticed. But that explanation felt hollow. For the next week, the knocking became a nightly occurrence. Sometimes it was soft, barely audible, and other times it was loud enough to rattle the door. No matter how many times I checked, there was never anyone there. The whispers started soon after. They were faint at first, like a breeze brushing against my ear, but they grew louder with each passing night. They didn't make sense, just fragments of sentences, disjointed and haunting. "Help me. Why won't you look? Behind you." I barely slept. I considered moving out, but I didn't want to seem crazy. Who would believe me? Instead, I started staying out late, spending time at the library or my friends' rooms, trying to avoid going back to my dorm until I absolutely had to. One night, after a late study session, I finally worked up the courage to confront whatever was happening. Armed with a flashlight and a hammer I had borrowed from the maintenance closet, I marched down to the janitor's closet, determined to prove to myself that the staircase was real. But when I opened the door, there was nothing there, just shelves lined with cleaning supplies, no stairs, no iron door, nothing. I stood there, my mind racing, when I felt a sudden chill. The whisper came again, louder than ever, and this time, it was right next to my ear. "Why won't you see me?" I spun around, swinging the hammer wildly, but the hallway was empty. I bolted back to my room, slamming the door behind me. My breathing was ragged, and tears streamed down my face. I couldn't take it anymore. That's when I noticed the mirror. It was sitting on my desk, the same cracked mirror I had seen in the underground room. My reflection stared back at me, but something was wrong. The face in the mirror wasn't mine. It was pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to bore into my soul. I screamed and threw the hammer at the mirror, shattering it into 1,000 pieces. For a moment, the room was silent. Then the whispers erupted, deafening and furious. The walls shook and the lights flickered violently. I grabbed my phone and ran out of the dorm, not stopping until I was halfway across campus. I spent the night on a bench outside, too terrified to go back. The next day I moved out. I didn't tell anyone why, just that I couldn't handle the isolation of living on the empty floor. The dorm manager didn't seem surprised. "It happens more often than you'd think," she said cryptically. To this day, I don't know what I experienced in that dorm. I've tried to rationalize it, to tell myself it was stress or sleep deprivation, but deep down, I know the truth. Something was in that building, something that wasn't supposed to be there, and it was watching me. When my parents moved us into the old farmhouse on the outskirts of town, I thought it would be the worst summer of my life. The place was ancient, with peeling wallpaper, creaky wooden floors, and an attic that made the whole house feel heavier. But we didn't have much of a choice. My dad had just taken a new job, and this was the only place we could afford. I was 17 at the time, counting the days until I could leave for college and never look back. The house was surrounded by fields on all sides, with no neighbors for miles. The isolation was unnerving, especially at night. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the entire area seemed to fall into complete silence. No crickets, no distant cars, just the sound of the wind whistling through the old house. It was the kind of silence that made your ears strain for something, anything, to break it. The first week, nothing unusual happened. I spent my time unpacking and getting used to the new place, but then I started hearing noises at night. Soft, faint creaks coming from above. At first I thought it was just the house settling. It was old after all. But the sounds didn't stop. They grew louder, more deliberate, until it was clear they were footsteps. Probably squirrels, my dad said when I mentioned it at breakfast one morning. Or raccoons. These old houses always have something living in the attic. He promised to check it out that weekend, but I could tell he wasn't worried. That night the footsteps were louder than ever. They started around midnight, slow and heavy, pacing back and forth directly above my bedroom. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, clutching my blanket like it could protect me. The worst part was that the attic hatch was in my room. Every time I heard those footsteps, I imagined something climbing down, creeping toward my bed. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal. Maybe a raccoon, like Dad said. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The footsteps were too heavy, too deliberate. They stopped and started, moving around as if whoever or whatever was up there knew exactly where it was going. The next morning, I demanded that Dad check the attic. He sighed and grabbed a flashlight, muttering about how he needed to find a ladder. When he finally pulled himself up into the attic, I stood below, hugging myself and biting my lip. I was too scared to go up there with him. Nothing but junk, he called down after a few minutes. A few old trunks, some boxes, no sign of animals. He climbed back down, brushing dust off his hands. You're letting your imagination get the best of you. But I knew what I had heard, and that night, I heard it again. The footsteps started even earlier this time, just as I was getting ready for bed. They were slow and deliberate, moving from one end of the attic to the other. Then they stopped directly above the hatch. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at it, waiting for it to open. It didn't. Instead, the footsteps retreated, fading into silence. I barely slept that night. The next day, I decided to investigate. I waited until my parents were out running errands and grabbed a flashlight from the garage. Climbing into the attic was the last thing I wanted to do, but I couldn't take the suspense anymore. I had to know what was up there. The attic was dark and dusty, with a single weak bulb hanging from the ceiling. I swept the flashlight beam across the space, my heart hammering in my chest. Just like Dad said, there were old trunks and boxes scattered around, covered in cobwebs. But no animals, no footprints, nothing that could explain the noises. Then I saw it. In the far corner of the attic, half hidden behind a stack of boxes, was a small wooden door. It was so low that you'd have to crouch to get through it, and it looked like it hadn't been opened in years. The edges were warped, the wood splintered and brittle. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to leave. But curiosity got the better of me. I knelt down and pulled the door open. Behind it was a narrow crawl space, barely big enough to fit a person. The air was colder there, and the smell of dampness hit me like a wave. I shone the flashlight inside and saw scratch marks on the walls. They were deep, jagged, and uneven, as if someone, or something, had been clawing at the wood. I slammed the door shut and bolted out of the attic, my hands shaking. I didn't tell my parents what I had seen. I didn't think they'd believe me. That night the footsteps came again, but this time, they didn't stay in the attic. I was lying in bed, staring at the hatch, when I heard the creak of the ladder being pulled down. My blood turned to ice as the footsteps descended slow and heavy onto the floor of my room. I couldn't see anything, it was too dark, but I could feel it. Something was there, standing at the foot of my bed. The air grew colder, and I could hear faint breathing, ragged and uneven. I wanted to scream, but my throat felt like it was frozen shut. I couldn't move, couldn't even blink. Then it spoke. "Why did you open the door?" The voice was low and gravelly, barely more than a whisper, but it sent chills down my spine. I couldn't answer. My body was paralyzed with fear. The thing moved closer, its breathing growing louder. I could feel its presence looming over me, heavy and oppressive. Then, just as suddenly as it had come, it was gone. The air warmed, and the room fell silent. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. When morning came, I packed a bag and told my parents I was going to stay with a friend. I didn't give them a reason, and they didn't press me. I think they could tell something was wrong. I never went back to the house. A month later, my dad's job transferred him to another town, and we moved out. I didn't ask the new owners if they had experienced anything strange. I didn't want to know. To this day, I can't explain what happened in that attic. I don't know what I saw or heard or what was behind that door. But sometimes late at night I think about the voice, the question it asked me, and I wonder what would have happened if I had answered. It all started the night I moved into my first apartment. It was a small one-bedroom place on the 5th floor of an old brick building downtown. I had saved up for months to afford it, and while it wasn't anything fancy, it was mine. The moment I stepped through the door with my last box, I felt an odd mix of pride and unease. The apartment was empty, the kind of quiet that feels too quiet, if that makes sense. I figured it was just nerves about living alone for the first time. The first couple of nights passed without incident. I spent most of my time unpacking and setting up my space. The building itself was old, with creaky floorboards and radiator pipes that hissed and clanked at random intervals. I chalked up the occasional strange noise to the quirks of living in an old place. Then, on the third night, I noticed something strange. I was sitting on my couch, scrolling through my phone, when I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. The large window in my living room faced another building across the narrow alley, and through the glass I thought I saw someone staring at me. I froze, squinting to get a better look. The figure was standing in one of the windows of the opposite building, a man with an unnervingly still posture. His face was hard to make out in the dim light, but I could tell he was looking directly at me. I tried to wave it off as coincidence. Maybe he wasn't actually looking at me, just out the window. Still, something about the way he stood there motionless sent a shiver down my spine. After a few moments, I pulled the curtains shut and turned on some music to distract myself. Out of sight, out of mind, right? The next night, it happened again. I was watching a movie when I glanced at the window and saw the same man in the same spot, standing perfectly still. This time I felt a wave of unease wash over me. It was as if he had been waiting for me to notice him. I stared back, hoping he would move, do something to prove he wasn't just some weird mannequin or optical illusion. He didn't move. I closed the curtains quickly and decided to call it a night. I told myself it was just a neighbor being strange, nothing to worry about. But deep down I knew something was off. The following evening, I avoided looking at the window altogether. I kept the curtains drawn and tried to focus on anything else. But around midnight, I heard something, a faint tapping sound. At first I thought it was the radiator acting up again, but the sound was too deliberate, too rhythmic. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the window. My heart raced as I slowly approached the curtains. The tapping continued, steady and relentless. I hesitated for a moment before pulling the curtains back, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The man wasn't in the other building anymore. He was standing outside my window, 5 stories up. There was no fire escape, no ledge wide enough for someone to stand on. He was just there, staring at me through the glass, his face pale and his eyes sunken. I stumbled backward, my hands trembling. The tapping stopped as soon as he saw me notice him. but he didn't move. He just stood there, his head tilted slightly like he was studying me. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything but stand there frozen in fear. After what felt like an eternity, I managed to grab my phone and dial 911. I kept my eyes on the man as I whispered into the phone, explaining what was happening. When the police arrived, he was gone. They searched the alley and the surrounding area but found no sign of him. One of the officers tried to reassure me, suggesting it was just a prank or maybe someone climbing the fire escape. I didn't bother arguing. There was no fire escape outside my window. I knew what I had seen, but I couldn't explain it. The officers left, promising to keep an eye on the area, and I locked every door and window in my apartment. I didn't sleep that night. For a few days, nothing happened. I started to think maybe it was over, that whoever or whatever the man was, he wasn't coming back. I even convinced myself I had imagined parts of it, that maybe I was just stressed from the move and my mind was playing tricks on me. But then, on the 6th night, I woke up to the sound of my bedroom door creaking open. My breath caught in my throat as I sat up in bed. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the street lamp outside. The door was open just a crack, and I could feel the presence of someone or something on the other side. I reached for my phone on the nightstand, but before I could grab it, the door swung open completely. Standing in the doorway was the man. He was even more terrifying up close. His skin was unnaturally pale, almost translucent, and his eyes were sunken and hollow. He didn't speak, didn't make a sound. He just stared at me, his head tilted at that same unnerving angle. I scrambled out of bed, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I backed away, pressing myself against the wall as he stepped into the room. He moved slowly, deliberately, his bare feet making no sound on the floor. "Who are you? What do you want?" I managed to choke out, my voice trembling. He didn't answer. Instead, he raised one hand and pointed at the window. I don't know what came over me, but I bolted. I ran past him, down the hall and out the front door of my apartment. I didn't stop until I was outside, standing in the middle of the street, gasping for air. I looked up at my apartment window, half expecting to see him standing there, but it was empty. I called the police again, and this time I refused to go back inside. I told them everything, every detail about the man and what had happened. They searched the apartment from top to bottom but found no sign of him. The locks on my door and windows were intact, and there was no way he could have gotten in or out without someone noticing. I moved out the next day. I didn't even bother taking most of my stuff. I just grabbed a suitcase and left. I stayed with a friend for a few weeks until I found a new place, far away from that apartment. But even now, months later, I still feel like he's watching me. Every time I pass a window, I can't help but glance, half expecting to see him standing there, staring at me with those hollow eyes. I've started sleeping with the curtains closed and the lights on, but it doesn't help. The feeling never goes away. I don't know who or what he was, but I know one thing for sure. He wasn't human, and he wasn't just passing through, he was looking for me. It was supposed to be a simple trip, a few nights alone in the family cabin in the woods to clear my head after a brutal semester at college. I'd grown up visiting the cabin with my parents, but this was the first time I'd be staying there alone. I thought it would be peaceful, a chance to unwind without distractions. I couldn't have been more wrong. The cabin was tucked deep into the forest, about a 20-minute drive from the nearest town. It was small and rustic, with a stone fireplace, a creaky wooden floor, and a single bedroom. Outside, the towering trees created a canopy that blocked most of the sunlight, leaving the area in a perpetual state of twilight. As a kid, I'd loved it. As an adult, it felt more isolating than comforting. I arrived in the late afternoon, unloaded my supplies, and settled in. The first evening was uneventful. I made dinner, read a book by the fire, and went to bed early. The silence of the woods was unnerving at first, but I told myself I'd get used to it. The second night was when things started to feel wrong. It began with a noise. I was sitting by the fireplace again, scrolling through my phone, when I heard a faint rustling outside. At first I thought it was just the wind or an animal moving through the underbrush, but the sound didn't stop. It grew louder, closer, until it was clear that whatever was making it was right outside the cabin. I stood up, my heart pounding, and moved toward the window. I peered out into the darkness, but the weak light from the fireplace didn't reach far. All I could see were the dense trees and the faint outline of the gravel path leading back to the main road. The rustling stopped abruptly, leaving only the deafening silence of the woods. I tried to shake it off. Probably a deer or a raccoon, I told myself. This was the wilderness after all. But something about the way the sound had stopped so suddenly put me on edge. It was as if whatever was out there knew I was watching. That night I struggled to fall asleep. Every creak of the cabin and whisper of the wind made my skin crawl. I told myself I was being ridiculous, letting my imagination run wild, but deep down I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Around 2 a.m. I was jolted awake by a new sound, a faint whispering. At first I thought it was part of a dream, but as I sat up in bed I realized it was real. The sound was coming from outside, low and indistinct, like multiple voices speaking at once. I couldn't make out any words, but the tone was unsettling, almost pleading. I crept to the window and peeked out. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, but I still couldn't see anything. The darkness outside was impenetrable, the trees swaying slightly in the wind. I debated turning on the porch light, but decided against it. Something told me I didn't want to draw attention to myself. The whispering continued for what felt like hours before fading away. I stayed up the rest of the night, clutching a flashlight and staring at the locked door, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. The next morning I decided to go for a walk to clear my head. The sunlight filtering through the trees made everything seem less frightening, and I started to convince myself that I had overreacted. I followed a familiar trail that looped around the property, trying to focus on the sound of birdsong and the crunch of leaves underfoot. About halfway through the loop, I noticed something strange. The forest around me had gone completely silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing. It was as if the entire woods were holding their breath. Then I saw them. At first, I thought they were just shadows, tall, thin shapes moving between the trees. But as I stared, I realized they weren't shadows at all. They were figures, pale and translucent, barely more than outlines. They moved slowly, deliberately, and though they didn't have faces, I could feel their gaze on me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The figures didn't come closer, but they didn't disappear either. They just stood there, swaying slightly, as if waiting for something. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs refused to move. Finally, I forced myself to turn around and walk back to the cabin, trying to keep my pace steady. I could feel them watching me the entire way. When I reached the cabin and slammed the door shut, I leaned against it, my heart racing. I didn't dare look out the window. That night, the whispering returned. It was louder this time, more frantic, as if the voices were surrounding the cabin. I could hear movement outside, soft footsteps, the creak of the porch boards, the occasional tap on the windows. I sat in the living room, clutching a kitchen knife and praying for it to stop. At one point, the whispering grew so loud that it felt like it was inside my head. I covered my ears, but it didn't help. The voices were everywhere, overlapping and chaotic, and though I still couldn't understand the words, I felt their meaning. Leave. Now. When the sun finally rose, I didn't waste any time. I packed my bags, loaded the car, and left without looking back. As I drove down the gravel path, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw them. Dozens of pale, translucent figures standing at the edge of the woods, watching me go. I haven't been back to the cabin since. I told my parents what happened, but they laughed it off, saying it was probably a bad dream or an overactive imagination. But I know what I saw, and sometimes late at night I still hear the whispering. It's faint, distant, but it's there. And every time, I wonder if they're trying to warn me or if they're waiting for me to come back. It happened last year when I moved into a small one-bedroom apartment in an old building downtown. I was in desperate need of a fresh start after a messy breakup, and figured this place, with its affordable rent and quiet neighborhood, was the perfect spot. The landlord was a kind but eccentric older man named Mr. Whitaker, who lived on the ground floor. He mentioned the building had been around since the early 1900s and had its fair share of character. I didn't think much of it at the time. The apartment itself was cozy but dated. The wooden floors creaked with every step, and the radiator groaned like it was alive. There were a few peculiar quirks, like the antique brass doorknobs that seemed to turn on their own sometimes, but I chalked it up to the age of the place. The first week was uneventful, aside from the occasional noise from my upstairs neighbor, who seemed to walk around a lot at odd hours. I didn't meet anyone else in the building besides Mr. Whitaker. He had mentioned there were only 3 other tenants, an older woman on the second floor, a single father with a young daughter on the third, and someone who lived directly above me on the fourth. I assumed the upstairs footsteps belonged to that last tenant, though I never saw them. On my third night in the apartment, I was jolted awake by a loud thud coming from above. I glanced at the clock, 2:13 a.m. Groggy and annoyed, I tried to ignore it, but the thudding continued, accompanied by the sound of heavy footsteps pacing back and forth. I groaned, covering my head with a pillow. Eventually, the noise stopped, and I fell back asleep. The next morning, I bumped into Mr. Whitaker in the hallway and casually mentioned the noise from upstairs. He gave me a puzzled look. "There's no one living on the 4th floor right now," he said. I blinked at him. "But I hear footsteps up there every night." He shrugged. "That apartment's been empty for months. I'll check it out, though. Might be squirrels or something." I didn't press the issue, but his response left me unsettled. That night I made a point to stay up late, determined to figure out what was going on. Sure enough, around midnight the footsteps started again. Slow, deliberate, pacing back and forth directly above me. I tiptoed to the hallway and stared at the ceiling, half expecting to see cracks forming from the force of the heavy steps. Heart pounding, I grabbed a broom and gently tapped the handle against the ceiling. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was complete silence. Then, the sound of something being dragged across the floor filled the air. It wasn't fast. It was slow and deliberate, like someone was scraping a heavy object across the wood. The noise moved toward the corner of the room, directly above me, and stopped again. I stood there, frozen until the silence became unbearable. Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I decided to go upstairs and check the empty apartment for myself. The staircase leading to the 4th floor was narrow and dimly lit, the overhead bulb flickering occasionally as if warning me to turn back. When I reached the top, I found the door to the 4th floor apartment slightly ajar. My breath caught in my throat. I hadn't heard anyone open it. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. I pushed the door open the rest of the way and stepped inside. The apartment was empty, no furniture, no signs of life, just a layer of dust coating the wooden floor. But then I noticed something strange. A single chair sat in the center of the room, facing the window. It wasn't just an ordinary chair. It was old, with ornate carvings on the backrest, the kind of chair you'd see in a museum or an antique shop. And on the floor around it were deep, jagged scratches, as if it had been dragged across the room over and over again. The air in the apartment felt heavy, almost oppressive, and I had the distinct feeling I wasn't alone. I backed out of the room and shut the door, my hands trembling. When I returned to my apartment, I locked the door and double-checked all the windows. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the footsteps to return. They didn't. The next day, I tried to convince myself I was overreacting. Maybe someone had been squatting in the apartment and left when they realized they weren't alone. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. Things only got worse from there. The following night, I woke up to the sound of knocking. At first, I thought it was coming from the front door, but as I sat up in bed, I realized it was coming from the wall behind me. Knock, knock, Knock. It was rhythmic, deliberate, and far too loud to be the pipes. I pressed my ear against the wall, my heart racing, and heard something faint, whispering. It was soft, almost too quiet to make out, but it was there. A low, guttural voice, muttering words I couldn't understand. I bolted out of bed, grabbed my phone, and called Mr. Whitaker. He didn't answer, so I left a shaky voicemail and spent the rest of the night sitting on the couch with the lights on. The next morning I found a note slipped under my door. It was written in a shaky hand, the letters uneven and smudged. Stay out of the fourth-floor apartment. Don't open the door. I stared at the note, my hands trembling. Who had written it? Was it Mr. Whitaker? One of the other tenants? Or someone? Or something else? That night, the noises escalated. The footsteps were louder, heavier, and accompanied by the sound of scratching. It was as if something was clawing at the walls, trying to get out. I tried to ignore it, but then the doorknob to my apartment started to rattle. I froze, staring at the door, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The rattling grew more frantic, and then it stopped. A single knock echoed through the apartment. Knock. And then a voice, low, gravelly, and impossible to place, spoke from the other side of the door. Let me in. I didn't respond. I didn't move. I just sat there, clutching my knees to my chest, praying it would go away. Eventually, the silence returned, but I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I packed my bags and left. I didn't even bother telling Mr. Whitaker. I just couldn't stay there another second. A few weeks later, I mustered the courage to look up the building's history. What I found sent chills down my spine. In the 1950s, a man named Charles Dempsey had lived in the fourth-floor apartment. He was a recluse, rarely seen by the other tenants. One night, the neighbors reported hearing strange noises coming from his unit, footsteps, dragging sounds, and muffled screams. When the landlord finally broke down the door, they found Charles sitting in a chair by the window, his throat slit and a note in his hand. The note read, "I'm sorry. I couldn't let him in." To this day, I don't know who or what was in that apartment with me. But sometimes when I'm alone at night, I think about the voice at my door, and I wonder what would have happened if I'd opened it. When I first rented the old Victorian house, I thought I had found a steal. It was a 3-bedroom property with a massive yard, ridiculously cheap for the area. The landlord, a tired-looking man in his late 60s, said he was desperate to find a tenant. His only warning was that the basement door tended to stick and might need replacing. I wasn't concerned. A sticky door was the least of my worries. I moved in on a cloudy October afternoon. The house smelled faintly of wood polish and mildew, but the charm of its creaky floors and antique fixtures overshadowed its flaws. After unpacking, I decided to explore the basement. The door, painted an old, peeling white, was at the end of the hallway off the kitchen. True to the landlord's word, the knob stuck as I turned it, and I had to shove my shoulder against the door to make it budge. The basement was cold and damp, with concrete walls and a single hanging bulb, casting a weak, flickering light. It smelled like earth and rust, and the air was heavy. The stairs creaked ominously as I descended, and I felt an odd pressure in my chest, like the air was too thick. The space was mostly empty, except for a few old shelves and a broken chair in the corner. There was one peculiar thing, though: a dark stain on the floor, almost black, about the size of a large rug. It was faint, as if someone had tried to scrub it out, but it was still visible. I brushed it off as a water stain or some other harmless quirk and went back upstairs. That night, the strangeness began. I was sitting in the living room unpacking books onto the built-in shelves when I heard it. A faint creaking sound, like footsteps on old wood. I froze, listening intently. It seemed to be coming from the basement. I told myself it was the house settling or maybe the wind playing tricks on me. But then the sound came again, deliberate, heavier this time. It was unmistakably the sound of someone walking. Grabbing a flashlight, I approached the basement door. It was shut, just as I had left it. I pressed my ear against the wood, holding my breath. The footsteps stopped. After a moment of silence, I opened the door. The basement was empty. The light bulb still flickered weakly, and the air was as cold as before. I shone my flashlight around, but nothing was out of place. Reluctantly, I chalked it up to my imagination and closed the door, making sure to lock it this time. As I crawled into bed later that night, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. Every creak of the house sounded like footsteps, and every shadow seemed darker than it should have been. I left a lamp on in my room and eventually drifted into a restless sleep. The next few days were quiet, but the unease lingered. I avoided the basement, telling myself there was no reason to go down there. But every night, just as I was about to fall asleep, I would hear it again, the faint creaking of footsteps pacing back and forth below me. One evening, about a week after I moved in, I returned home late from work. The house felt colder than usual, and as I set my bag down in the kitchen, I noticed the basement door was slightly ajar. My stomach dropped. I knew I had locked it. The air seemed heavier as I approached the door. I hesitated, staring into the darkness beyond, before finally reaching out to pull it shut. As I did, I heard a faint sound from the basement, a low, guttural whisper, almost like a voice, but too distorted to understand. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands trembling. I barely slept that night. The following day, I called the landlord and asked if he'd ever experienced anything strange in the house. He laughed nervously and assured me the house was perfectly fine. "Old houses make noise," he said. "You're just not used to it yet." I didn't believe him. That night, things escalated. It started around midnight. I was lying in bed when I heard the familiar creaking of footsteps. But this time, they didn't stay in the basement. I heard the basement door creak open, followed by the sound of slow, deliberate steps moving through the house. My heart raced as I reached for my phone, my hands shaking. I tried to dial 911, but my fingers fumbled, and the phone fell to the floor. I could hear the footsteps growing closer, moving up the stairs toward my bedroom. I grabbed the lamp from my nightstand, clutching it like a weapon, and backed into the corner of the room. The footsteps stopped just outside my door. I held my breath, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But there was only silence. Minutes passed. Finally, I worked up the courage to approach the door. I flung it open, holding the lamp high, but the hallway was empty. I spent the rest of the night sitting on the floor with every light in the house turned on, staring at the locked basement door. The next day, I decided I couldn't live like this anymore. I called a friend, Sarah, and asked her to come over. I didn't tell her everything, just that I was feeling uneasy and wanted company. When she arrived, I felt a little safer. We spent the evening talking and watching movies, trying to keep my mind off the basement. But around 10 p.m., the atmosphere in the house changed. The air grew colder, and the lights flickered. Sarah noticed it too. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice uneasy. Before I could answer, we heard it, the footsteps. This time they were louder, more frantic, as if someone was running in circles below us. "What the hell is that?" Sarah whispered. I didn't answer. Grabbing a flashlight, I led her to the basement door. It was still locked, but the sounds continued, growing louder and more erratic. "Don't open it," Sarah pleaded, but I had to. I couldn't take it anymore. With trembling hands, I unlocked the door and pushed it open. The basement was pitch black. The light bulb that had once flickered weakly was now completely out. As we stood there frozen, the footsteps stopped. Then, from the darkness, came the whispering. It was louder this time, unmistakable. A chorus of voices, overlapping and distorted, speaking in a language I couldn't understand. And then, something moved. A shadow emerged from the corner of the basement, darker than the surrounding darkness. It was tall, impossibly tall, its form shifting and rippling like smoke. Sarah screamed, and I slammed the door shut, locking it again. We ran out of the house and didn't stop until we were in her car, driving away. I called the landlord the next morning and told him I was breaking the lease. I didn't care about the deposit. He didn't seem surprised. "You lasted longer than most," he said quietly before hanging up. I've never been back to that house, and I don't plan to. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear those footsteps in my dreams pacing back and forth, waiting for me to come back. It was the summer before my junior year of college when I decided to take a job as a caretaker for a remote cabin in the woods. The owner, a retired professor named Dr. Ellison, hired me to watch over the property while he spent a few months overseas. The cabin was nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains, miles from the nearest town. It seemed like the perfect opportunity to earn some money and enjoy a bit of solitude. The drive to the cabin took me through winding mountain roads and dense forests that seemed untouched by time. When I arrived, Dr. Ellison gave me a quick tour. The cabin was rustic, but well-maintained, with a cozy living room, a small kitchen, and a single bedroom. There was no Wi-Fi or cell service, but there was an old landline in case of emergencies. He warned me about the wildlife, bears, coyotes, and the occasional mountain lion, and told me to stay indoors after dark. That first night, the isolation felt like a welcome escape. I sat on the porch listening to the symphony of crickets and frogs, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon and the stars emerged. The air was cool and crisp, and for the first time in months, I felt at peace. But that peace didn't last long. The first strange incident happened on my second night. I was lying in bed, drifting off to sleep, when I heard a noise outside, a low, guttural growl, followed by the crunch of footsteps on gravel. My heart skipped a beat. Remembering Dr. Ellison's warning about wildlife, I grabbed the flashlight from my nightstand and cautiously approached the window. The porch was empty, bathed in pale moonlight. I scanned the edge of the woods but saw nothing. Telling myself it was probably just a coyote or a raccoon, I went back to bed. The next morning, I found claw marks on the porch railing. They were deep and jagged, too large for any animal I knew of. My unease grew, but I convinced myself it must have been a bear. As the days went on, the strange occurrences escalated. I'd hear footsteps circling the cabin at odd hours, but every time I checked, nothing was there. Once, while chopping firewood, I found strange symbols carved into the trees around the property. Intricate, swirling patterns that didn't look like anything natural. I called Dr. Ellison to ask if he knew about the carvings. His voice grew quiet. "Those were there when I bought the place," he said. "I wouldn't worry about them. Just don't go wandering too far into the woods." That evening, as I sat on the porch, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The forest, which had seemed so tranquil when I first arrived, now felt oppressive, as if the trees themselves were closing in on me. And then, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, I saw it. At the edge of the tree line, about 50 yards away, something moved. At first I thought it was a deer, but as it stepped closer, I realized it was standing on two legs. The figure was tall, impossibly thin, with elongated limbs and skin so pale it seemed to glow in the fading light. Its head was misshapen, with eyes that gleamed like wet stones in the dark. It stood there, motionless, staring at me. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. For what felt like an eternity, neither of us moved. And then, with a sudden jerking motion, it turned and disappeared into the woods. I ran inside, locking the door behind me. My hands trembled as I fumbled with the latch on the windows, securing every entry point I could think of. I spent the rest of the night sitting on the couch with the flashlight in one hand and a fire poker in the other, jumping at every creak and rustle. The next morning I found footprints in the dirt outside the cabin. They were massive, far larger than any humans, and had a strange, almost claw-like shape. I wanted to leave, but the nearest town was over 30 miles away, and without cell service I had no way to call for help. I told myself I'd tough it out for a few more days and then find a way to leave early. But the thing in the woods didn't wait that long. On my fifth night, I woke to the sound of scratching at the door. It was slow and deliberate, as if whatever was outside wanted me to know it was there. I sat up in bed, clutching the fire poker, my heart hammering in my chest. The scratching stopped, and for a moment there was silence. Then came the knock, 3 sharp, deliberate raps on the door. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaking. No response. I crept to the living room, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The knocking came again, louder this time, accompanied by a low, guttural growl. I peeked through the curtains, but there was nothing on the porch, just the empty night and the faint rustle of the trees. And then, from behind me, I heard it. A whisper, soft and guttural, coming from inside the cabin. I spun around, shining the flashlight into the dark corners of the room, but there was nothing there. The whisper came again, closer this time, and the air grew thick with the smell of rot. I backed into the corner of the room, clutching the fire poker like a lifeline. The whispers grew louder, overlapping and distorted, filling the room like a chorus of the damned. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The rest of the night passed in a haze of terror. I sat in the corner, staring at the front door, waiting for something, anything to happen. But the house remained silent. When the first light of dawn broke through the windows, I grabbed my backpack, stuffed it with essentials, and left the cabin. I didn't care about the job or the paycheck. I just needed to get out. The hike back to the main road took hours, and the entire time I felt like I was being watched. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves sent my heart racing. When I finally reached the road, I flagged down the first car I saw and begged the driver to take me to town. I didn't explain what had happened. I wasn't sure they'd believe me. A week later, Dr. Ellison called asking why I'd left. I told him everything. The footsteps, the claw marks, the thing in the woods. There was a long silence on the other end of the line before he spoke. "You saw it, didn't you?" he said quietly. "What is it?" I demanded. "I don't know," he admitted. "But it's been there as long as I've owned the cabin. That's why I leave every summer. It doesn't like when people stay too long." I hung up and never spoke to him again. To this day, I can't go near the woods without feeling that same oppressive weight, as if the thing in the forest is still watching, waiting for me to come back. And sometimes, late at night, I dream of those claw marks on the porch and the pale figure standing at the edge of the trees. I don't think I'll ever feel truly safe again. The house was never supposed to be permanent. I'd rented it because it was cheap and I needed a place to crash while I figured out my next steps in life. It sat on the outskirts of a small, dying town, the kind of place where everyone knew each other and strangers were met with cautious curiosity. The landlord was a wiry man with darting eyes who'd offered me the keys without asking too many questions, as long as I paid the rent on time. The first time I saw the house, I wasn't impressed. It was old, with peeling paint and windows that seemed to sag under their own weight. But the rent was unbeatable, and the location was remote enough that I wouldn't have to deal with nosy neighbors. At the time, I thought solitude was exactly what I needed. The house came partially furnished with mismatched, outdated furniture, but it was clean. The air inside carried a faint, musty smell, but nothing worse than I'd expected. I unpacked quickly and spent the first evening lounging on the lumpy couch, scrolling through old DVDs I'd brought since the house didn't have Wi-Fi. It wasn't until I went to bed that I noticed the whispers. They were faint, barely audible, like the sound of wind brushing against a window, but they were there. At first I thought it was just the old house settling, creaking under the weight of its years. But as I lay in bed, staring at the dark ceiling, I realized it wasn't random. It was rhythmic, repeating. A chill ran down my spine, but I tried to ignore it. I buried my face in the pillow and forced myself to sleep. The next morning, the whispers were gone. The house was silent, almost unnervingly so. I chalked up the noise to an overactive imagination, or maybe a draft somewhere in the walls. But the whispers came back the next night. This time they were louder, more distinct. They seemed to come from everywhere at once, wrapping around me like a shroud. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding, and strained to listen. It wasn't the wind. It was a voice. It was impossible to make out the words, but there was no mistaking the low, guttural tone. It was speaking in a language I didn't understand, and the sound made my skin crawl. I grabbed my phone, intending to record it, but as soon as I hit the record button, the whispers stopped. The silence was sudden and deafening, like the house itself was holding its breath. I didn't sleep that night. The next day I called the landlord. "Hey," I began, trying to keep my voice steady. "Is there something I should know about this house?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. "I mean, I keep hearing things at night. Voices." Another pause. "It's an old house," he said finally. "Old houses make noise. You'll get used to it." I didn't believe him, but I didn't press further. Something about his tone made me think he knew more than he was letting on. That night, the whispers started earlier. I was in the living room flipping through an old magazine when I heard it, a faint hissing voice coming from the hallway. I froze, the magazine slipping from my hands. The voice grew louder, clearer. It wasn't coming from the hallway. It was coming from inside the walls. I bolted upstairs to my bedroom, slamming the door behind me. I sat on the bed, clutching my phone, waiting for the whispers to stop. But they didn't. They grew louder, closer. I could hear multiple voices now, overlapping and chaotic, like a crowd speaking all at once. The sound was coming from the corner of the room, where the old wardrobe stood. I stared at it, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The whispers seemed to seep out from behind the wardrobe, curling into the air like smoke. And then the wardrobe creaked. It was a small sound, but it sent a jolt of terror through me. Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I grabbed a flashlight and approached the wardrobe. My hand trembled as I reached for the handle, the whispers growing louder with each step. I yanked the door open. Nothing. The wardrobe was empty, except for a faint, lingering smell of earth and rot. I slammed the door shut and backed away, my pulse racing. The whispers stopped. The next morning, I decided I couldn't stay in the house any longer. I packed my bags and called the landlord, telling him I was leaving. But as I loaded my car, I realized I'd left my phone charger in the bedroom. I hesitated, staring at the house, before forcing myself to go back inside. The air felt heavier, colder. I hurried upstairs, grabbed the charger, and was about to leave when I noticed something on the wall. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it hadn't been there before. Words, scratched into the plaster, in the same strange, guttural language I'd heard in the whispers. I didn't stick around to read them. As I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of something in the mirror above the dresser. A shadow. It wasn't mine. It moved independently, shifting across the room even though I was standing still. I ran. I didn't stop until I was in my car, the engine roaring as I sped away from the house. I never looked back, not even once. A week later, I got a call from the landlord. "You left some stuff behind," he said. "You planning to come back for it?" "No," I said quickly. "Keep it. Burn it. I don't care." He was silent for a moment before speaking again. "You heard them, didn't you?" The question sent a chill down my spine. "What are they?" I whispered. "I don't know," he admitted. "But they've been there as long as I've owned the place. Some people say the house is cursed. Others think it's haunted. I've stopped trying to figure it out." I hung up and blocked his number. To this day, I can't explain what I experienced in that house. The whispers, the shadows, the strange words. They haunt me still, lingering in the corners of my mind. And sometimes late at night when the world is quiet, I think I can hear them again, faint and distant, calling me back to the house I'll never return to. It was supposed to be an easy job. A friend of a friend had put me in touch with the manager of an old manufacturing plant on the outskirts of town. They needed a night watchman to keep an eye on the property while renovations were underway. The place had been abandoned for years, but a new company had bought it and was planning to reopen it. The manager, a gruff man named Mr. Hall, seemed skeptical about hiring someone as young as me, but he eventually relented when I assured him I could handle it. He handed me a set of keys, a flashlight, and a walkie-talkie. Keep the place locked up, he said. Make your rounds every couple of hours and don't go poking around where you don't need to. This place has its quirks. What kind of quirks? I asked, trying to sound casual. Old buildings make noises, he replied. You'll get used to it. The plant was massive, with sprawling hallways, cavernous workrooms, and rusting machinery that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. My job was to patrol the perimeter, check the locks, and make sure no one was trespassing. Easy enough, or so I thought. The first night was uneventful. I wandered through the plant, my footsteps echoing in the empty hallways. The place had an eerie vibe, but I chalked it up to its age and disrepair. It wasn't until the second night that I started noticing things. I was making my rounds when I heard it, a faint tapping sound coming from one of the workrooms. I stopped, straining to listen, but the sound stopped as quickly as it had started. Probably just a loose pipe, I muttered to myself, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling creeping over me. But as the night went on, the noises continued. Footsteps echoing in hallways where no one should have been. Doors creaking open, even though I'd checked them all and found them locked. And the whispers, soft, indistinct murmurs that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere all at once. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind or maybe my imagination. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. On the third night, I brought a thermos of coffee and a book, hoping to distract myself from the creeping unease. I set up in the small security office near the entrance, keeping an eye on the old CCTV monitors. Around midnight, I saw something on one of the screens. It was a figure, barely visible, standing at the far end of one of the hallways. The image was grainy and distorted, but I could tell it wasn't just a shadow. "Hello?" I called into the walkie-talkie, even though I knew no one else was in the building. The figure didn't move. Grabbing my flashlight, I forced myself to leave the office and head toward the hallway. My heart pounded as I approached the spot where I'd seen the figure. It was empty. I shined the flashlight around, checking every corner, but there was no sign of anyone. I was about to head back to the office when I noticed something on the floor. It was a shoe print smeared in what looked like oil. The strange thing was, it didn't lead anywhere. It was just there. I spent the rest of the night in the office, too afraid to continue my rounds. By the fourth night, I was ready to quit, but the thought of explaining my decision to Mr. Hall made me hesitate. I didn't want to come across as weak or unreliable. That night, the whispers started as soon as I stepped into the building. They were louder than before, almost insistent, as if they were trying to get my attention. As I made my way through the plant, the air grew colder. The temperature had been mild all week, but now it felt like I'd stepped into a freezer. My breath came out in visible puffs and my fingers went numb. I was walking through one of the old storage rooms when I heard a loud crash behind me. Spinning around, I saw that one of the shelves had toppled over, scattering boxes and debris across the floor. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. There was no response. And then, from the corner of the room, I saw it. A shadow darker than the surrounding darkness moving slowly toward me. I froze, unable to move as the shadow grew closer. It didn't have a defined shape, but there was something about it that felt wrong, like it didn't belong in this world. The whispers grew louder, overlapping and chaotic, until they were all I could hear. My vision blurred and I felt a crushing weight pressing down on my chest. "Leave," a voice hissed, clear and unmistakable. I didn't need to be told twice. I bolted from the room, my flashlight flickering as I ran. The hallways seemed to stretch endlessly, twisting and turning in ways that didn't make sense. It was as if the building itself was trying to trap me. Finally, I burst through the front doors and into the cool night air. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. I called Mr. Hall the next morning and told him I couldn't continue the job. I didn't explain why, and he didn't ask. A few weeks later, I heard from a friend that the plant had been shut down again. The renovations had been abandoned and the new company had pulled out of the deal. To this day, I don't know what I encountered in that plant, but sometimes, late at night, I'll hear faint whispers, even though I'm miles away from that place. and I'll wonder if I truly left it behind or if a part of it followed me. When I first moved into my new apartment, I thought it would be the fresh start I needed. I had recently broken up with my boyfriend, and the idea of being alone in a new place felt like the perfect way to reclaim my independence. The apartment was small but charming, located in a quiet old building in the heart of the city. The landlord, a kind elderly woman named Mrs. Benson, had shown me around and made sure everything was in working order. There were hardwood floors, large windows that let in plenty of light, and a cozy little kitchen. It was exactly what I needed, peaceful and private. She warned me that the apartment had a history. Nothing too sinister, just the usual stories about old buildings having character and a few quirks. The building's been here since the 1920s, she said, her voice thick with nostalgia. Some of the previous tenants swore it was haunted, but I've never noticed anything odd. You should be just fine. I chuckled, brushing off her warning as nothing more than an old lady's tale to add flavor to the history of the place. It wasn't unusual for buildings this old to have rumors attached to them. I was more than willing to ignore the strange noises she mentioned and focus on settling in. For the first few weeks, everything was perfect. I spent my days unpacking and getting used to my new routine. But on the third week, something strange happened. It started one evening after I'd returned home from work. I was sitting on the couch reading a book when I heard a soft thump from above. The sound was subtle, like something light had fallen onto the floor in the attic. I wasn't overly concerned. After all, it was an old building, and I assumed it was just the natural settling of the structure. But then, over the next few days, the thumping continued, always at night, always around the same time, just after the clock struck midnight. At first, I convinced myself it was just rats or some other harmless creature in the attic. I wasn't thrilled about the idea of rodents living above me, but I figured I could handle it, so I didn't mention anything to Mrs. Benson. However, the noise didn't stop. It got worse. One night as I lay in bed trying to drift off to sleep, the thumping grew louder. It was rhythmic, almost like footsteps, as if something or someone was pacing back and forth up there. I lay perfectly still, my heart racing in my chest. The idea of a person in the attic seemed ridiculous, but the sound was unmistakable. My skin prickled with anxiety, and I could no longer dismiss it as an animal. The next morning, I decided to investigate. I couldn't stand the thought of whatever was going on above my head. I grabbed a chair and climbed up to the attic door. It was an old wooden door with a rusty latch, and I had to pull hard to get it open. The smell hit me immediately. Stale air mixed with the scent of dust and something faintly musty. I hesitated, then switched on the light. The attic was dark, but not too cluttered. There were boxes stacked along the walls, old furniture covered in sheets, and forgotten bits of the past, like an old rocking chair in the corner. I looked around, but there was nothing out of the ordinary, no signs of animal activity. Nothing moved. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. That night, the thumping returned. But this time, it wasn't just thumping. It was scratching. Loud, frantic, desperate scratching. It sounded like fingernails dragging against wood. It came from the corner of the room just beneath the attic door. I shot up from bed, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound was so real, so sharp, that I almost felt the vibrations in my bones. I sat frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do. Should I call someone? Should I check again? I couldn't bring myself to go back up there. But as the minutes passed, the scratching stopped as abruptly as it had started. The next day I called Mrs. Benson. I told her about the noises, trying to keep my voice steady, not wanting to sound like I was imagining things. "Oh, that old thing?" she said in a matter-of-fact tone. "I've heard stories about that before. People say the previous tenants complained about noises in the attic too. I think it's just the house settling. Nothing to worry about, dear." But I wasn't convinced. I couldn't shake the feeling that something more was happening, something I couldn't explain. I spent the next few nights with the light on, jumping at every creak and groan of the building. The thumping and scratching continued, but now there was something else. A soft whispering, barely audible but unmistakable. It was as though voices were speaking in the attic, murmuring just below my hearing range. The more I listened, the more the voices seemed to become clearer. It was almost as if they were calling my name. The breaking point came one night when I was sitting in the living room, the quiet of the apartment making me feel restless. The sound of movement above my head began again, but this time it was different. It wasn't just a thump or a scrape, it was louder, more frantic, like something was trying to escape from the attic. I stood up, heart pounding in my chest, and went to the attic door again. When I opened it this time, the smell was unbearable, like rotting wood and mildew. The attic seemed darker, more oppressive. I stepped in cautiously, my flashlight casting eerie shadows across the room. I scanned the space, feeling more and more uncomfortable. Something about the atmosphere had changed. I don't know how I can describe it, but I could feel something or someone watching me from the far corner of the attic. I moved toward the back of the room, where the whispers were the loudest. My flashlight flickered as I approached the spot where I'd heard the voices, and the temperature dropped drastically. I could see my breath in the air. Then, just as I turned to leave, I saw it. A figure. A shadow standing motionless in the far corner of the attic. It was tall and thin, with limbs that seemed far too long for a normal human being. Its face, if you could even call it a face, was an unnatural blur, as if the features kept shifting as though trying to avoid being seen. My heart stopped. My body froze in place. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. The figure didn't approach me. It just stood there watching, silent. The whispers grew louder, filling the room until the words became clear. "Get out," they hissed. "Leave now." I couldn't take it anymore. I stumbled backward, tripping over boxes as I hurried toward the stairs. I slammed the attic door shut, nearly falling as I made my way down. My breath was ragged, my heart racing. I couldn't explain what I had seen, but I knew one thing for sure. Whatever was up there didn't want me there. I called Mrs. Benson the next morning, nearly hysterical, demanding that she come take a look. She arrived with a concerned expression, but when I tried to explain what I had seen, she just shook her head. "Sometimes the mind plays tricks," she said gently. "This old building has a way of making people feel things that aren't there. I'm sure it's just your imagination running wild, but I knew what I saw. I couldn't stay there any longer. I packed my things that same day and moved out. I didn't look back. I didn't even want to step foot near that building again. To this day, I can't explain what happened in that attic. I don't know if it was a haunting or if the house had something sinister hidden within its walls, but I know what I saw. And I'll never forget the whispers in the dark or the shape standing in the shadows, watching me with those unblinking, shifting eyes. I wonder how many others have experienced the same thing in that old apartment, and how many more will after me. It was a quiet summer night when I first noticed the figure. I had just finished a long shift at the diner and was looking forward to the peaceful solitude of my small apartment, the kind of quiet you only get when everyone else is asleep. I'd moved to the city only a few months earlier, wanting a fresh start after a difficult breakup. The apartment was nothing fancy, just a small one-bedroom on the second floor of an old building. But it was mine. It was supposed to be my sanctuary. The first few weeks were uneventful. I spent my days working at the diner and my nights either reading or watching TV. It wasn't the most exciting life, but it was comfortable, and I was content with it. But that all changed one night about a month after I moved in. It was around 2 a.m. when I first noticed the figure. I had just turned off the TV and was getting ready to head to bed when I glanced out my bedroom window. I lived on the second floor, and my window faced an alley that ran along the side of the building. Normally the alley was empty at night, just a narrow stretch of concrete lined with garbage bins. But that night, I saw someone standing at the end of the alley, staring up at my window. At first I thought it was just a trick of the light, or maybe someone walking by, but then the person didn't move. They just stood there, unmoving, staring up at me. I felt a chill crawl up my spine, and my breath caught in my throat. I couldn't make out any details about the person, just a vague silhouette, too far away to see clearly, but I could tell they were watching me. I tried to shake it off. It's probably nothing, I told myself. Maybe it's just a late-night passerby or someone looking for a shortcut. But something about it didn't sit right with me. I watched for a few moments, my eyes locked on the figure, and then, as if sensing my gaze, it moved. It didn't walk away. It didn't run. It simply turned, very slowly, and disappeared into the darkness of the alley. I wasn't sure what to think. I knew it could have been anyone, but the stillness of the moment, how they hadn't moved until I noticed them, left me feeling uneasy. I decided not to overthink it. I closed the blinds, locked the window, and went to bed. The next few nights, the same thing happened. I would look out my window, and there they would be, standing at the end of the alley, staring up at my apartment. Every time I would try to rationalize it, a neighbor, someone lost, maybe someone just passing by. But with each encounter, I felt more and more uneasy. There was something about the way the figure stood, as if it was waiting for me to notice it, and once I did, it would always slowly turn and disappear into the darkness. I decided to take action. I couldn't keep living like this, constantly looking over my shoulder, feeling like I was being watched. So, one evening, I stayed up late, waiting for the figure to appear. I wanted to see who or what it was. I sat by the window, my heart racing, staring out into the darkness, waiting for a sign. Around 2 a.m., like clockwork, I saw it again. The figure stood at the end of the alley, motionless, staring up at me. This time I was ready. I grabbed my phone and turned on the camera, hoping to capture something, anything, that could explain what was happening. I focused the camera on the figure and zoomed in. The details were still unclear, but I could tell the person was wearing a dark jacket or hoodie, their face obscured by shadows. I clicked the camera, hoping for a clear shot, but just as I did, the figure shifted. Slowly it turned its head, its gaze moving from the alley to directly at my window. My heart skipped a beat. It was as if the person knew I was watching them. I froze, my phone still in my hand, as the figure stared directly into my eyes. For a brief moment, I thought I saw something, a flash of light, a glint in their eyes. But it was gone before I could fully process it. And then, just like every other night, the figure turned and disappeared into the darkness. I couldn't move. I sat there, staring at the empty alley, my mind racing. Who was this person? Why were they watching me? And most importantly, why did it feel so wrong? I spent the next few hours awake, my mind racing with possibilities. I kept telling myself it was just someone who lived nearby, maybe someone with strange habits. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something sinister about it. I decided to take a closer look at the building the next morning, hoping to find something that would explain what was happening. I took a walk around the block, peering up at the second-floor windows of my building. I wanted to know if anyone else had noticed anything strange. As I walked, I saw a few neighbors leaving their apartments, nothing unusual, just people going about their day. But as I walked closer to the alley, something caught my eye. A small, weathered sign hung on the side of the building, near the back entrance. It wasn't visible from my window, but it was clearly old. I approached it, squinting to read the faded lettering. It read, "Watchers welcome, no questions asked." My stomach dropped. I couldn't make sense of it. I had never seen the sign before, and there was no way it had been there when I first moved in. It felt like a cruel joke, but as I stood there staring at the sign, I felt a shiver run down my spine. The alley seemed quieter than usual, almost too quiet. I hurried back to my apartment, heart pounding. I had to know more. I called Mrs. Carlson, the building's manager, hoping she could shed some light on the strange happenings. Her response chilled me to the core. "Oh, the Watchers," she said, her voice slow and distant. "You've seen them, haven't you? They've been around for years. I'm afraid there's nothing we can do about it. They come and go." They never hurt anyone, but they never leave either. What do you mean? I asked, my voice trembling. They're part of the building's history, Mrs. Carlson explained. The people who lived here before you, they always said the same thing. It's like a ritual. The watchers, they stand outside at night. They wait. And if you look at them long enough, they'll vanish. Why? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. I don't know. No one knows. But it's been happening for as long as anyone can remember. They're just there, watching, always watching. I felt my chest tighten as I processed her words. The watchers weren't a figment of my imagination. They were real, and they had been watching me. I never saw the figure again after that night, but the feeling of being watched never left. Sometimes when I'm walking down the street, I'll catch a glimpse of movement from the corner of my eye, just a shadow at the edge of my vision. I don't know if it's them, but I don't look anymore. I've moved out of that apartment now, but the memories of those nights linger, haunting me like a shadow I can't escape. The watchers are still out there, waiting. Always waiting. It was a Tuesday evening when everything began. I had just turned 26, and after years of living with roommates and bouncing from place to place, I finally found a small apartment in the city all to myself. It was modest, but it was mine. A one-bedroom with a tiny living room, and enough space to spread out my things. The best part? It was in a relatively quiet neighborhood, surrounded by old brick buildings and quiet streets. It was exactly what I had been looking for. Peaceful, with a sense of calm that I hadn't experienced in years. The apartment was older, the kind that had a history you could almost feel in the walls. The floors creaked in certain places, and the plumbing was a little unreliable, but nothing too concerning. I didn't think twice when the landlord gave me a tour and mentioned that the building had been around for nearly a century. It had character, he said. It had charm. The first few days went by without incident. I unpacked, decorated, and settled into my new life. My friends and family came by to see the place, and I quickly fell into a routine. I'd wake up early for work, return home in the evening, make dinner, and relax with a book or a show before heading to bed. It was a simple life, but it felt good. Then about 2 weeks into my new routine, I noticed something odd. It started with the mirrors. I have always been a little sensitive to reflections. Nothing too dramatic, just a feeling that sometimes when I glance at a mirror, there's something off about it. Usually it's just my imagination. But after I moved into this apartment, that sensation became more frequent. It wasn't that the mirrors were any different. They were just old, standard mirrors. One above the bathroom sink, one in the hallway, and a full-length mirror in my bedroom. But one night, as I was getting ready for bed, I glanced into the bedroom mirror while brushing my teeth. For a split second, I thought I saw something behind me. Just a shadow, but too dark and defined to be my own reflection. I quickly turned around, but there was nothing there. I shrugged it off. I was tired, and I figured my eyes were playing tricks on me. But the feeling didn't go away. I couldn't shake the sensation that someone was standing just behind me whenever I looked into that mirror. The next few nights I found myself avoiding the mirrors altogether. I would quickly look away if I caught my reflection or deliberately turn the other way when walking past. But even then, I would sometimes catch a glimpse of something strange, a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye, or the reflection of someone standing just behind me. I always thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, until one evening, it got worse. I was sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone, when I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps coming from behind me. At first I thought it was just the building settling. Old apartments have a way of making strange noises at night. But then the footsteps grew louder, more deliberate. I felt my heart begin to race as the sound came closer, like someone was walking toward me. I turned around, half expecting to see a neighbor or perhaps even a late visitor. But there was no one there. The room was empty. I sat frozen for a few seconds, my mind spinning with questions. Was I hearing things? Could it be a dream? But then I realized something even more unsettling. The sound wasn't just in my ears. It was in the mirror. I stood up, my pulse quickening, and walked cautiously over to the hallway mirror. I hesitated, my reflection staring back at me, but this time I didn't look away. I stared into it, waiting, and that's when I saw it. In the mirror, standing right behind me, was a man. He was tall, his figure just out of focus enough that I couldn't make out his face. He wore a dark coat, almost like an old-fashioned suit, and stood perfectly still. His arms hung at his sides, his posture rigid and unnaturally straight. I couldn't tell if his eyes were fixed on me or if he was simply staring into the distance. But it didn't matter. I knew, without a doubt, that he wasn't in the room with me. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest, but the room was empty. There was no man, no figure standing in the corner. Just the empty walls and the soft glow of the lamp. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me as I turned back to the mirror. The man was still there, standing behind me. He hadn't moved an inch. I backed away slowly, my eyes never leaving the mirror. But then, something strange happened. The man's reflection began to smile. It was a slow, deliberate smile, one that seemed to stretch unnaturally wide. I felt my stomach churn as the smile grew bigger and bigger, until it was almost grotesque. His teeth were sharp, jagged, and the expression on his face was something that made my skin crawl. I had to get out of there. I didn't know what was happening, but I couldn't stay in that apartment a moment longer. I grabbed my phone, ran out of the apartment, and didn't stop until I reached the corner of the street. I stood there, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my heart still pounding in my chest. The city felt empty at that hour, the streets eerily quiet. I spent the rest of the night in a 24-hour diner, staring at my phone and trying to make sense of what had just happened. Was I losing my mind? Was I dreaming? I didn't have the answers, but I couldn't shake the image of that man in the mirror. His twisted smile, his cold eyes, his stillness. It was as though he was waiting for me, and I didn't know why. The next day I called in sick to work. I couldn't bring myself to go back to the apartment. I spent the day at a friend's house, telling her about what had happened, but she just brushed it off, telling me I was probably overtired or just imagining things. I wanted to believe that, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. That night, I decided to return to the apartment. I wasn't sure if I could face the mirrors again, but I had to know what was going on. As I stood outside the door, I felt a wave of dread wash over me. I took a deep breath, turned the key, and stepped inside. Everything was quiet. Too quiet. The apartment looked exactly the same as when I left, but I felt a presence there, a tension in the air. I walked slowly into the living room, my eyes scanning the walls, the mirrors, everything. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I knew I had to confront whatever was happening. I finally walked into the hallway, my gaze drawn to the mirror. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help myself. I had to see if the man was still there. The moment I looked into the mirror, I froze. The man was there, but this time his reflection wasn't just standing behind me. He was closer, much closer. His face was clearer now. His features were twisted, his eyes dark and hollow, his smile wider than before. And this time it wasn't just a smile. His lips moved. He whispered something, but I couldn't make out the words. I backed away, but my reflection didn't move. The man didn't blink, didn't look away. His eyes never left me. And then, the reflection began to move on its own. I screamed, but no sound came out. I turned and ran. I didn't know where I was going, I just needed to get out. The apartment felt suffocating, the walls closing in around me. I never went back to that apartment. I packed my things, and within days, I was gone. I don't know who or what was in those mirrors, but I know one thing for certain. They were not just reflections, and I'll never look into another mirror the same way again. I had just started my second semester at college when I moved into the small off-campus apartment. It was the perfect place for someone like me. Quiet, affordable, and close enough to school that I didn't have to worry about commuting. The building was older with peeling paint and creaky floorboards, but it had charm. I didn't mind. I had spent my entire life in the city, and I was used to the noise, the odd quirks of older buildings. It felt comfortable. The apartment itself was cozy with just enough space for me to spread out. A small kitchen, a living room, a bathroom, and a bedroom. The walls were thin, but the neighbors were quiet, so I rarely heard much from them. It was, in every sense, the ideal place for a college student to get some peace and focus on studies. For the first few weeks I had no complaints. The days were long with classes and study sessions, and the nights were peaceful, with nothing more exciting than the occasional late-night snack. But that all changed one cold Thursday night in early February. It was around 2 a.m. when I first noticed something off. I had just finished a long night of studying and was heading to bed when I heard it. A soft, creaking sound from the hallway outside my apartment. At first I figured it was just the building settling. Old buildings do that, especially when the temperature drops. But then the creaking turned into footsteps, slow, deliberate steps, one after another. I froze, my heart pounding. I was certain no one else was in the building. The apartment complex was small, and I had never seen anyone else in the hall this late at night. I listened carefully, straining to hear. The footsteps grew louder, closer. I grabbed my phone off the nightstand and checked the time. 2:15 a.m. The footsteps stopped right outside my door. I held my breath, hoping whoever it was would just move along. But the silence that followed felt even more unsettling. It wasn't just quiet. It was heavy, like something was waiting. I sat still, clutching my phone, hoping it was some sort of mistake or maybe just the sound of an old pipe or something. But when I heard the creaking of the floorboards again, this time right next to my bedroom door, I couldn't ignore it any longer. Someone was outside my room. I debated whether or not I should call the police, but what would I tell them? Someone is walking around my apartment building at 2 a.m. and I'm too scared to open the door? No, I needed to handle this myself. After a few more moments of tense silence, I slowly got out of bed and crept toward the door. My heart was beating in my chest as I peeked through the peephole. But to my surprise, there was no one there. The hallway was empty. No shadows, no figures, nothing. I sighed in relief, half laughing at myself for getting so worked up. It must have just been my imagination. I returned to bed and tried to get some sleep, but the uneasy feeling wouldn't leave. Something about that silence, about the way the footsteps had stopped right outside my door, gnawed at me. The next morning, I shrugged off the incident. It was probably nothing. Just the wind or the house settling, I thought. But as the days went on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The footsteps returned. It wasn't every night, but it was enough to make me nervous. I'd hear them around the same time, 2 a.m., followed by that eerie silence. Sometimes they stopped at my door. Sometimes they moved down the hallway, but always at night, always in the dark. I started to notice other things too. Small things at first. Things I tried to dismiss as my imagination running wild. I'd leave a book on the counter and come back to find it moved slightly to the left. My phone charger would be unplugged, even though I was sure I had plugged it in the night before. But it wasn't until I started hearing whispers that I began to realize something was wrong. One night, as I lay in bed trying to sleep, I heard voices, soft, indistinct whispers. They came from the hallway, muffled, like people talking just out of earshot. But there was no one in the hall. I was alone in the apartment. The voices grew louder, as though someone was right outside my door, just out of sight, whispering secrets to each other. I couldn't make out the words, but I knew something was very wrong. I lay there frozen, afraid to move, listening to the eerie murmurs that filled the air. It was only when the whispering stopped and the footsteps began again, closer this time, that I finally grabbed my phone and called my best friend Claire. "Claire, something's going on," I said when she picked up. "I'm hearing footsteps and whispers in the hallway at night. I don't know what to do." "Are you sure it's not just the building settling?" she asked, her voice groggy from just waking up. "I don't know. It's too consistent. And they always stop right outside my door," I replied, my voice shaking. It's like they're waiting for me. You're freaking yourself out. Maybe you're just being paranoid, Claire suggested. Why don't you just lock your door, make sure the windows are closed, and try to sleep? I don't know if that will work, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. It's like they know I'm here. I can hear them breathing too. It's weird. Okay, just take a deep breath, Claire said. I'm sure it's nothing. If you feel that uncomfortable, maybe you should stay with me tonight. I was hesitant, but at that moment I was so shaken that I agreed. Claire lived a few blocks away, and I figured it was better to be with someone than alone in that apartment. I packed a bag, locked the door, and made my way out into the cold night. That night I slept soundly at Claire's place, but I couldn't stop thinking about the apartment. What had been happening? Was I just imagining things, or was something truly wrong with that place? The next day I went back to the apartment, determined to find some explanation. I checked everything, windows, doors, even the locks. But everything seemed in order. Nothing unusual. I tried to convince myself that it had all been a bad dream, but when night fell and the hours passed, I couldn't ignore the unsettling feeling that lingered. It was just before midnight when I heard it again. The footsteps. At first I was too afraid to even look toward the door, but the sound grew louder and I couldn't help myself. I got up, walked to the peephole, and looked out into the hallway. There was nothing. No one. But then, just as I was about to turn away, I saw it. A shadow moved across the floor at the end of the hallway. It wasn't human. It was tall and dark, and it moved in a way that made no sense. It didn't walk. It just drifted. I stepped back from the door, my heart racing. The whispering started again, soft and unintelligible, but growing louder. It was all around me, filling the apartment. I couldn't breathe. I turned on all the lights, grabbed my phone, and ran out of the apartment. I didn't care about anything anymore. I just had to get out, I ran down the stairs and into the cold night air. That was the last time I ever set foot in that apartment. I stayed with Claire for a few days while I figured out what to do. I told my landlord what had been happening, but he dismissed it, claiming the building was just old and creaky. He offered to have someone check the pipes, but nothing ever came of it. I don't know who or what was walking around that hallway or why. I don't know what those shadows were or who they were waiting for. But I know one thing. I will never forget the sound of footsteps in the dark, and I will never live alone in that apartment again. I always thought I was a pretty rational person. Skeptical maybe to a fault, but I prided myself on not letting my imagination get the best of me. But that all changed when I moved into my first apartment by myself. I had just graduated college and was eager to start my adult life. After months of searching for a place, I found a small, affordable one-bedroom unit in an older building. The location was perfect, quiet, with tree-lined streets, and just a few blocks away from my new job. The building was old, but I didn't mind. I liked the character of the place, the creaky floors and the slightly musty smell. It felt like home. The first few nights in the apartment were normal. I unpacked my things, set up my furniture, and made it cozy. There were some odd sounds, the occasional thud or creak of the building settling, but nothing that seemed unusual for an old apartment. I was living alone for the first time, and I suppose the silence of an empty apartment made me hyper-aware of every little noise. But then, about a week after I moved in, things started to get strange. It started with the knocking. At first it was faint, almost imperceptible. I would hear it late at night, after I'd already gone to bed. It sounded like it was coming from the walls, a soft rhythmic tapping that I could never quite place. I figured it was just the plumbing or maybe something to do with the old heating system. Still, it made me uneasy, especially when I would wake up in the middle of the night and hear it again. After a few nights, the knocking grew louder and more persistent. It wasn't just at night anymore. It would happen during the day, too, when I was home alone. Sometimes it would come from the wall near my bed, other times from the ceiling or floor. I even checked the walls a couple of times, but there was nothing there. No pipes, no wires, just the plaster and old wood. I started to tell myself it was just an old building making noise and I shouldn't let it bother me. But then, things took a darker turn. One night, as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard a voice. It was soft at first, a faint whispering, but as I tried to focus on it, I couldn't make out the words. It was as though someone was talking in the room with me, but when I looked around, there was no one there. I thought maybe it was just my imagination, or perhaps the sound of traffic from outside mixing with the wind. But the voice came again the next night. This time it was clearer, louder. I could hear a distinct hello, whispered from somewhere in the room. My blood ran cold. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. The voice didn't sound like it came from outside. It was as though it was inside the apartment right behind me. I turned on the light and looked around, but I was alone. The apartment was still, except for the faint sound of the wind tapping against the windows. I couldn't explain it, but I knew what I had heard, and I couldn't ignore it. The next few nights the voice came back. It always sounded like it was calling to me, asking for something, or perhaps waiting for a response. I would sit there in the dark, too scared to move, straining my ears to hear the whispers. But no matter how hard I listened, I couldn't make out the words. That was when the real terror began. One evening, I returned to the apartment after a long day of work. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and immediately felt something was wrong. The apartment was too quiet, too still. I didn't hear the usual sounds of the city, the faint hum of cars passing by or the distant chatter of neighbors. It was almost as if the air had thickened, like the apartment was holding its breath. I checked the kitchen, the living room, and the bathroom, but everything seemed fine. No doors were left open, no windows ajar. I was about to relax when I noticed something. My bedroom door was slightly open. I was certain I had closed it when I left that morning. My stomach tightened as I approached it, feeling the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I pushed the door open slowly, and that's when I saw it. A dark figure stood at the foot of my bed. It was tall, thin, and completely still. Its features were indistinct, just a shadow in the dim light of the room. I couldn't make out any details, no eyes, no mouth, just an empty, hollow shape. I froze in place, my heart racing. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I just stood there staring at the figure, waiting for it to make a move, but it didn't. It just stood there, unmoving. I don't know how long I stood there, but eventually, I managed to force myself to turn and run out of the apartment. I didn't even stop to grab my coat or my phone. I just ran down the stairs and out into the street, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't go back to the apartment that night. I stayed at a friend's house, shaken, too terrified to be alone. I tried to rationalize it, to tell myself that maybe it was just a trick of the light or that I had been too tired. But deep down, I knew what I had seen. That thing in my room wasn't a figment of my imagination. It was real. The next day, I went back to the apartment. I didn't know what I was expecting to find, but I felt compelled to return. I opened the door carefully, half expecting to see the figure still standing there. But when I stepped inside, everything seemed normal. The apartment was quiet. No shadows, no strange noises. I looked around the room, my eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. Nothing. It was just an ordinary apartment. But as I was about to leave the bedroom, I glanced at the mirror on the wall. It was a small, rectangular mirror. Nothing special. But when I looked into it, my reflection wasn't quite right. It was me, but it wasn't. In the reflection, I was standing perfectly still, just like I was in the room. But behind me there was a figure, the same shadow I had seen the night before, standing just a few inches away from me. I spun around, my heart skipping a beat, but once again, there was nothing there. I turned back to the mirror, and the figure was gone. I felt the blood drain from my face as I realized what was happening. It wasn't just in my imagination. The figure, whatever it was able to appear in reflections. The whispers came back that night. Only this time they were louder. They seemed to surround me, coming from every direction. I couldn't escape them. I couldn't escape the feeling that something was in the apartment with me, watching me, waiting for me to acknowledge it. I didn't sleep that night. I spent hours staring at the walls, listening for any sounds, but by morning, everything seemed to be back to normal. The whispers stopped, the figure vanished from the mirrors, and the apartment felt empty again. But I knew better now. I couldn't stay there any longer. The next week, I packed up my things and left. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me, that I hadn't truly escaped whatever had been in that apartment. Even now, months later, I still hear those whispers when I'm alone at night. I can still feel that cold presence, like someone, or something, is watching me from just behind my shoulder. I don't know what it was, or why it chose to visit me in that apartment, but I do know that I'll never forget the feeling of being alone at night, with the whispers in the walls and the shadows in the corners waiting for me to turn around, and I'll never look in a mirror the same way again. It was a rainy evening when I moved into my new apartment. I had just finished my first week at a new job in the city, and everything felt like a fresh start. The apartment was on the third floor of an old building with thick, creaky floors and windows that rattled in the wind. The building had a certain charm to it, though, and I was excited to make it my own. I was looking forward to the peace and quiet of living alone after weeks of sharing a cramped dorm room with roommates. That first night, I unpacked a few boxes, set up my furniture, and made a quick dinner before settling in to enjoy some time to myself. The rain outside pattered softly against the window, and the world felt far away. I felt completely safe in my new home, or at least I convinced myself that I did. As the night wore on, I started to feel a little uneasy, though I couldn't figure out why. There was something about the stillness of the apartment, the way the sound of the rain seemed to amplify every small noise in the building, that made me feel on edge. But I tried to push those feelings away, and eventually fell asleep. The next few days passed without incident. I got into a routine, waking up early for work, coming home in the evening and spending my nights in the apartment, catching up on TV shows or reading. Occasionally I'd hear the creaks and groans of the old building, but nothing out of the ordinary. But that all changed one night. It was late, past midnight, and I had just finished watching a movie. The apartment was dark except for the soft glow of the TV. The rain had stopped and everything outside was quiet. I got up from the couch to head to bed, and that's when I noticed something strange. There was a faint shape in the window, just beyond the curtain. It looked like a figure, tall, thin, and standing motionless in the dark. I froze, staring at the figure. My heart started to pound as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The figure didn't move. It didn't appear to be a reflection. It was simply there, standing in the window, staring back at me. I told myself it was nothing, a trick of the light, maybe a shadow from a tree outside. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination running wild, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I slowly approached the window, my mind racing. My heart beat faster as I reached for the curtain and pulled it back, expecting to find nothing. But when I looked outside, there was no one there. The street was empty, and the only light came from the distant streetlights that lined the road. I stared out for a few moments, scanning the area, but there was no sign of anyone. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding and turned back toward the apartment. But as I walked away from the window, I couldn't shake the image of that figure in the glass. What had I seen? Had it been my reflection? No, it was something different. It had been too clear, too defined, to be a mere reflection. I went to bed that night with uneasy thoughts swirling in my mind. I lay awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling, trying to push away the unsettling feeling. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I drifted off to sleep. The next few days were uneventful. I couldn't get the figure out of my mind, but I tried to move on and forget about it. I had a busy week at work, and by the time I got home, I was too tired to think about anything else. But on the fourth night, it happened again. I had just finished dinner, and was lounging on the couch, watching TV, when I noticed the same figure again. This time it was more distinct. There was no mistaking it. A tall, thin figure standing motionless in the window staring at me. My blood ran cold. I couldn't breathe. I didn't want to look, but I had to. I stood up, my legs shaking, and slowly made my way toward the window. I was terrified of what I might see, but I pulled back the curtain anyway. And once again there was no one there. The street was empty, and the windows of the other apartments across the building were dark. I felt a shiver run down my spine. I couldn't explain it. I didn't know what was going on, but something wasn't right. I spent the rest of the night in a state of unease, too afraid to sleep and too paranoid to focus on anything else. The figure had to be some kind of hallucination, right? Maybe I was just tired. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But I wasn't sure anymore. The thought that someone, or something, was watching me from outside made my skin crawl. That night, I left the curtains open, hoping that I could see the figure again and maybe this time I'd be able to make sense of it. But nothing happened. The window stayed dark. Over the next few days, I told myself that it had all been my imagination. I tried to convince myself that I was overthinking things, but deep down, I knew I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Then on the 6th night, it happened again. I was reading in bed when I saw the figure in the window once more. This time, though, it wasn't just standing there. The figure had moved. It was now pressed against the glass, its face only inches from the window, its features obscured by the reflection of the room behind me. But I could still make out the shape of its body, tall, thin, and unnatural. I screamed. The sound caught in my throat as I stumbled backward. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest, my hands trembling. Without thinking, I rushed to the window and threw open the curtain. This time, when I looked outside, there was no mistaking it. There was someone standing right there in the shadows staring at me. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, its face hidden in the darkness. I felt my stomach twist in fear. I could see the outline of a person, but nothing more. No detail, no distinguishing features, just a dark shape that seemed to belong in the shadows. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't just call the police. What would I say? That there was someone standing outside my window. That wasn't enough to warrant a visit. I had no proof. The person wasn't doing anything, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I tried to convince myself to stay calm. I closed the curtain, locked the window, and turned off the lights. But the fear lingered, like a weight on my chest. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, listening for any sound. The rain began again, tapping softly against the glass. But I couldn't sleep. The next day, I called a friend and asked her to come over. I didn't want to be alone anymore. I needed someone to tell me that I wasn't losing my mind, that what I was experiencing was real. She arrived in the late afternoon and immediately noticed the tension in the air. I tried to act normal, but I could tell she was worried. We spent the evening together watching TV, talking, and trying to distract myself from the haunting presence that still seemed to linger in the apartment. As night fell, the apartment grew quiet again, and that's when I saw it, the figure. It was back. This time, though, I didn't have the courage to go to the window. I just sat there, frozen in fear, watching as the figure pressed its face against the glass, just as it had the night before. But this time, I wasn't alone. I wasn't imagining it. My friend saw it too. She gasped and jumped to her feet. "What the hell is that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that it was real, and it was out there, watching. We both stood there staring at the figure through the window, but it didn't move. It just remained there, pressed against the glass, its face obscured by the darkness outside. At that moment, I knew I couldn't stay in that apartment any longer. Whatever was out there, whatever had been watching me, it wasn't safe. I moved out the next week. I never did find out who or what that figure was, or why it chose to haunt my apartment. but I never went back. And to this day, I can't shake the feeling that something, or someone, is still out there, waiting in the dark. I had always loved old houses. There was something about their creaky floors, cracked plaster, and the smell of musty wood that made me feel nostalgic. I would often spend weekends exploring abandoned buildings, but I never thought I'd end up living in one. I was moving to a new city for a job, and after weeks of searching for an affordable place to stay, I found it. An old house on the outskirts, just outside the city limits. It was cheap, secluded, and seemed like the perfect place for someone trying to make a fresh start. The house was enormous, with a large front porch that wrapped around the entire front, and windows that stretched from floor to ceiling. The previous owners had clearly left in a hurry, leaving behind old furniture, books, and personal items. I didn't think too much about it at the time, other than the fact that it would be easy to move in and make the space my own. I remember the first night I spent there. It was a Friday, and I had just unpacked the last of my boxes. The house was eerily quiet, and despite the fact that I had cleaned up the main rooms, the place still felt a little off. I had no idea why, but I was tired from the move and decided to get some sleep. That night I woke up in the middle of the night. I wasn't sure what had woken me. It wasn't a sound, but rather a feeling. It was as though the air in the room had changed. The temperature had dropped suddenly, and my body was covered in goosebumps. I looked around, but everything seemed normal. I turned my head toward the window, and that's when I saw it. There was no moon that night, just the inky darkness of the sky. But there was something out there. I couldn't see it clearly, but there was a figure. No, not a figure, but a shape. It was standing just beyond the edge of the porch, just outside the glow of the streetlight. I blinked, trying to focus my eyes, but when I looked again, it was gone. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself that it was just my imagination. Maybe the house was playing tricks on me, or maybe it was just the wind. I pulled the blanket over my head and forced myself back to sleep. The next morning, I tried to dismiss the strange feeling I had in the night. After all, it was an old house, and old houses have a way of making your mind wander. But as the day went on, I started to notice something else. The house was quiet, too quiet. There was no sound, no creaks of the floorboards, no wind outside, no hum of the fridge. It was as though everything in the house had gone still, as though the house itself was holding its breath. I shrugged it off, though. It wasn't like I was expecting a soundtrack to play in the background. I went about my day, unpacking a few more boxes and setting up the furniture in my new bedroom. By late afternoon, I felt like I had settled in. I was starting to feel more comfortable in the house, and I convinced myself that I had just been imagining things. That night, things took a turn for the worse. I woke up again, in the middle of the night. This time, it wasn't the temperature or the air that felt different. It was the shadows. There was something wrong with them. They seemed to shift, to move on their own. I looked around my bedroom, my heart racing, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The room was dark, save for the faint glow of the moonlight coming through the window. But when I looked at the wall across from me, the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally. They twisted and curled like dark tendrils, moving independently of the furniture and objects that cast them. It was as though they had a life of their own. I sat up in bed, frozen, watching the shadows dance across the walls. I blinked hard, thinking that my eyes were playing tricks on me. But the shadows didn't stop. They grew longer, stretching across the room, as though they were reaching for me. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears, my hands shaking. I turned away from the shadows and buried my head under the covers, hoping it was just my imagination. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in the room. The next morning, I went downstairs to get some breakfast. I figured I would take a walk around the property to clear my head. I needed fresh air, and the thought of being in that house for another night was starting to make me uneasy. But as I walked through the house, I began to notice more strange things. The hallway was darker than usual. The wallpaper, which had once seemed perfectly fine, now appeared faded, peeling in places. I touched it absent-mindedly, and to my horror it crumbled under my fingers, revealing old dry wood behind it. As I continued through the hallway, I noticed that the lights flickered and the air felt heavier. The shadows that stretched across the floor seemed to move, even though no one was around. I was beginning to feel like I was losing my mind. Was this house haunted? Was it always like this? Or had I just imagined everything? But then I remembered something else. The house had no shadows. At least none that made sense. The lights in the hallways and rooms were on, but the shadows didn't match up with the furniture or the angle of the light. They didn't appear in places where there should have been shadows. It was as though the house itself was casting them from places they didn't belong. That night, the terror returned. I had just settled into bed when I heard a faint sound. It was barely audible, but I could hear something tapping against the window. The house had an old wooden frame, so it was common for the wind to make noises against the glass, but this was different. It wasn't the wind. It sounded like someone was lightly knocking, tapping on the window as if trying to get my attention. I tried to ignore it, but the tapping continued, growing louder and more insistent. My heart raced as I slowly turned my head toward the window. I could see the faint outline of something, a shape, just beyond the glass. At first, I couldn't make it out, but as I stared at it, I realized what I was looking at. There was someone outside, standing in the dark, watching me through the window. I could see nothing of the person's face, just a vague shape, but what terrified me the most was that there were no shadows. The figure was completely devoid of them, as though the darkness itself had rejected them. I tried to look away, but my eyes were glued to the window, unable to break the connection. I couldn't breathe. My body went numb. I was too scared to move, too afraid to make a sound. And then suddenly the figure disappeared. It didn't retreat or move away. It just vanished. One moment it was there, and the next, it was gone. I sat there, my mind racing, my chest heaving with shallow breaths. The room was still, and the house was silent. But something felt wrong. The air was thick with dread. The shadows that had once been so strange now seemed to be closing in on me, moving closer with each passing second. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. I spent the rest of the hours staring at the walls, waiting for the figure to return, waiting for the shadows to come to life again. By morning, I had made up my mind. I couldn't stay in that house any longer. I packed my things and left. I don't know what it was that haunted that place, but I'm sure it wasn't just the house. It was something in the shadows, something that couldn't be seen but could always be felt. And to this day, I refuse to stay in any house that doesn't have a shadow. Because I know now that it isn't just the light that makes shadows. It's what the light hides. And sometimes, the shadows are the only thing keeping you safe. I had always considered myself a logical person. I didn't believe in ghosts, spirits, or anything supernatural. To me, the world was simply a place governed by science and reason. So when I moved into a small old house on the outskirts of town, I never once entertained the thought that there could be anything strange about it. I was just looking for a quiet, affordable place to live while I got my life back on track after a recent breakup. The house was perfect for that. Cheap, secluded, and far away from the hustle and bustle of the city. The house itself was a charming two-story cottage, though it was clear it had seen better days. The paint on the walls was peeling, the floors creaked with every step, and the windows were foggy with age. But despite its worn-out exterior, there was a certain comfort in it. The backyard had a lovely view of a forest that stretched far into the distance, and the house, though old, felt like it had character. I was on my own for the first time in years, and the isolation was a welcome change from the chaos of my previous life. I spent the first few days unpacking and settling in, making the place feel like home. The first night was uneventful, though I remember feeling a little unsettled as the wind howled through the trees outside. It was a kind of eerie calm that I couldn't quite explain, but I brushed it off. Old houses make strange noises, and I had always been a heavy sleeper. The second night was different. I woke up to the sound of what seemed like a whisper, soft but persistent. At first I thought I was dreaming, but then I heard it again, a faint voice, low and murmuring. My eyes snapped open, my heart racing in the darkness. The whispering wasn't coming from the street outside. It was coming from inside the house. My first instinct was to chalk it up to the house settling or maybe the wind causing the old beams to creak. But the whispers were too deliberate, too clear. I held my breath, listening. The voice was indistinct, like a conversation I couldn't quite understand, but it was definitely there. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but the longer I lay there, the more real it became. The whispering seemed to be coming from the floor, as if the very wood beneath me was alive, speaking to me in hushed tones. My skin crawled. I sat up in bed, straining my ears, trying to locate where the sound was coming from. The room was still and dark, the only light coming from the sliver of moon that slipped through the curtains. I got out of bed, my feet cold on the wooden floor, and made my way to the living room. The house was eerily quiet now. The whispers had stopped. I stood there for a moment, my heart still racing. Nothing seemed out of place, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I slowly turned back to head to my bedroom when I noticed something strange. The floorboards in the hallway creaked under my weight, but there was something else, a soft scraping sound, like something being dragged along the floor beneath me. I froze. I bent down, pressing my ear to the floor. There was a faint, rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming on wood just beneath the surface. My blood ran cold. There was no way it could be the house settling. This was something else entirely. I jumped back, stumbling to my feet. My mind raced, but my body felt like it was frozen in place. I don't know how long I stood there, but eventually, I managed to gather enough courage to move toward the door. I grabbed my phone from the coffee table and called my friend, Sarah, who lived just a few miles away. She had always been more open-minded about the supernatural, and I needed someone to reassure me that I wasn't losing my mind. I couldn't explain it, but I was terrified. I waited for what felt like an eternity for Sarah to pick up the phone. When she finally answered, I quickly blurted out what had happened. "Sarah, I'm hearing things. I don't know what it is, but something's wrong with this house. The floor, it's like it's alive. I can hear whispers, and there's something under the floor. Tapping." She was quiet for a moment before speaking. "Are you sure it's not just the house settling? You know these old places can be pretty creepy at night." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe it was just the house, that I was overreacting. But the sound, those whispers, that tapping, kept playing in my mind. "I don't know, Sarah. It doesn't feel like that. It feels wrong. Can you come over?" After a few more minutes of convincing, Sarah agreed to come over. She wasn't too far away, but as I waited for her, I couldn't shake the growing sense of dread in my chest. It was as though the house itself was pressing in on me, closing me in with its secrets. I tried to distract myself by turning on the lights and watching TV, but the feeling of being watched never left me. Finally, after what seemed like hours, I heard the sound of a car pulling up outside. I rushed to the door, relief washing over me when I saw Sarah standing on the porch, her face worried but calm. "Okay, I'm here. Let's figure this out," she said, her voice steady. I led her inside, explaining everything as we made our way through the house. "It's weird," I said. "The whispers, the tapping under the floor. It's like it's coming from everywhere." Sarah nodded, her brow furrowed. She took a deep breath and then asked, "Do you have any history on the house? Who lived here before you?" I hadn't thought to ask. The landlord had just told me the previous tenants had moved out a few months ago, and they hadn't been there long, but Sarah's question made me uneasy. What if something had happened in the house? What if there was more to this place than I realized? Sarah suggested we check the basement. I hadn't been down there yet, as I'd figured it was just storage space, but she thought that might be where the sounds were coming from. "Old houses can have strange pipes and wiring," she reasoned, "but we should check." With a deep breath, I grabbed a flashlight and led the way down the narrow staircase to the basement. It smelled damp and musty, and the air felt thick with dust. We walked around slowly, shining the light over the old boxes and forgotten furniture. The basement was cold, the walls lined with unfinished wood, and the floor was uneven. I wasn't sure what I expected to find, but as we moved deeper into the space, I felt an overwhelming sense of unease. We stopped near the far wall where there was an old wooden crate stacked against the corner. Sarah shined the flashlight on it. The light flickered for a moment before going out completely. I cursed under my breath as I fumbled with the flashlight, trying to get it to work again. When I turned it back on, it illuminated something that made my blood run cold. The floor beneath the crate seemed to shift as though something was moving beneath it. A low guttural growl echoed through the air, followed by a series of rapid taps like frantic footsteps. The whispers returned, louder this time, clearer, but still indecipherable. I felt a sharp coldness crawl up my spine, my skin tingling with dread. Without thinking, I turned and ran up the stairs, Sarah hot on my heels. We didn't stop until we were both safely outside, standing in the front yard, gasping for air. We didn't speak for a long time. The night was still, and the only sound was the distant rustling of trees in the wind. I never returned to that house. I don't know what was under those floorboards or who or what was whispering to me. I never got the chance to find out. All I know is that some places hold more than just memories. Some places are full of things that should never be uncovered. And I'm sure deep down I made the right choice. Because sometimes, the scariest things aren't the shadows or the noises you hear at night. It's the things that hide beneath the surface, waiting for the moment when you're alone, vulnerable and just curious enough to listen. I never believed in anything paranormal. Growing up, I was always the type to laugh off ghost stories and dismiss strange occurrences as coincidences or overactive imaginations. But all of that changed when I moved into the old house on Maple Street. It was the perfect place for me to escape after a difficult breakup. The rent was cheap, the location quiet, and the house itself was filled with character. Sure, it was a bit run down, peeling paint, creaky floors, and an overgrown yard. But to me, that just added to its charm. The house had been vacant for a while, and the landlord didn't tell me much about its history. He seemed a bit rushed when I signed the lease, and the paperwork was minimal. At the time, I didn't think anything of it. I was just eager to get settled in. The first few nights were uneventful. I unpacked boxes, set up my furniture, and got comfortable in my new space. The house was big, with 2 stories and a large attic that I had yet to explore. I didn't need much, just a bed, a few chairs, and a table to eat at. It wasn't until my 3rd night in the house that things started to feel off. It began with a sound, a faint tapping, like someone was gently knocking on the wall. At first I figured it was just the house settling, an old house like that making its usual creaks and groans. But the sound didn't stop. It persisted, rhythmic and steady, coming from the wall next to my bedroom. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself that it was just the house's way of adjusting to the cold night air. But when I turned over in bed, I realized that the tapping seemed to be coming from a specific spot in the wall, almost like it was following me as I moved. I held my breath, straining my ears to listen. The tapping continued for what felt like hours, never varying in tempo. At one point, I thought I heard a faint voice mixed in with the noise. But when I focused on it, the sound vanished, replaced once again by the rhythmic tapping. By the time I finally managed to fall asleep, I had convinced myself that it was just the house, old and worn, making its usual sounds. But the next night, the tapping returned, and this time it was louder. I woke up to the same rhythmic sound, but now it felt like it was coming from within the very walls of my room. It was as if someone was tapping from the inside of the walls, trying to get my attention. The sound was so precise, so deliberate, that I couldn't shake the feeling that it was meant for me. I got out of bed and walked over to the wall, pressing my ear against it, hoping to hear something more. What I heard next made my blood run cold. There was a voice, faint and muffled but unmistakable. It wasn't speaking words, at least, not at first. It was more like a series of low murmurs, a barely audible whisper that seemed to come from all around me. The voice was indecipherable, but the tone was unmistakably human. It sounded like someone was trapped or desperate, calling for help from within the walls. My heart pounded in my chest, and I instinctively backed away from the wall, my mind racing. I couldn't make sense of what I was hearing. Was I imagining it? Was it just the house settling again? But then the voice became clearer. It wasn't just a whisper anymore. It was a cry for help, distorted and muffled, but undeniably there. I pressed my hand to my mouth to stifle a scream as I stood frozen, my body tingling with fear. It was as though something or someone was trapped inside the very walls of the house, trying to get my attention. I ran out of my room, my feet pounding against the wooden floor. My head was spinning, and my thoughts were jumbled. I needed to get out of there. But when I reached the front door, it wouldn't open. I turned the handle, but the door wouldn't budge. Panic set in as I pulled harder on the handle, but it felt as though something was holding it shut. I backed away, breathing heavily, and noticed something strange. The house was still, too still. There were no creaks, no sounds, no whispers. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. I glanced back at the walls, my eyes drawn to the spot where the tapping had originated. I needed to know what was happening. I had to find out what was in the walls. But as I moved closer, I realized that the sounds were gone. The silence was overwhelming, and the air felt heavy, thick with a sense of dread. I decided to investigate. I couldn't stay in that room another minute, not with the terror that was slowly creeping into my mind. I went to the attic, hoping to find some explanation for the strange noises. The attic was dark and filled with dusty boxes and old furniture. There was a small window, but the moonlight barely filtered through the grime on the glass. I stepped cautiously around the clutter, my flashlight casting eerie shadows on the walls. As I moved further into the attic, I stumbled upon an old wooden door that was partially hidden behind a stack of boxes. It was odd. I hadn't noticed it before. The door looked like it led to another room, but it was locked. I examined the door closely, running my fingers over the worn wood. The surface was smooth, but there was something odd about it. I could feel a faint vibration, a low hum coming from the other side. It was as if something or someone was trying to get out. With trembling hands, I searched the attic for a way to open the door. After what felt like an eternity, I found a rusty key hidden inside an old box of papers. My heart raced as I inserted the key into the lock, praying that I was wrong, praying that there was no need to open this door. But the key turned, and the door creaked open, revealing a small dark room. Inside, there was nothing but a small, dusty mattress on the floor and old, decaying furniture, but something was off. The air in the room was thick, heavy, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. I walked cautiously inside, my flashlight trembling in my hand, and that's when I saw it. The walls were covered in strange, faded markings. It looked like scratches, as though someone had clawed at the walls from the inside, desperate to escape. My breath caught in my throat as I realized that the markings were fresh, newer than the rest of the decay. They were still visible, even though the room had been sealed for years. I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind me. My heart jumped in my chest as I tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. The room seemed to close in on me, and the whispers returned, louder now, almost deafening. I could hear the voice, clear and desperate, crying out for help. The sound of scratching filled the air as if something was clawing at the walls from the other side, trying to reach me. I don't know how long I was trapped in that room, but eventually, the door creaked open again. I stumbled out, gasping for air, my legs shaking beneath me. The whispers died down and the house fell silent once more. I didn't stay another night in that house. I packed my things and left as quickly as I could, never looking back. To this day, I can't explain what I heard or what I saw in that room. All I know is that something was trapped inside those walls, something that had been clawing its way out for years, and it was waiting for someone to hear its desperate cries for help. I don't know what it was. Maybe it was the ghost of someone who had been locked away in that house long ago. Maybe it was something else entirely. But I know one thing for sure. There's something in that house, something that speaks through the walls, and I don't ever want to hear it again. I didn't always believe in the paranormal. In fact, I was one of those people who would scoff at the idea of haunted houses, ghosts, or anything supernatural. I thought that if you believed in that sort of thing, you were simply trying to explain away things you couldn't understand. I had lived in a few houses growing up, and I never experienced anything strange. That is, until I moved into the old apartment on Oak Street. The apartment building was ancient, built in the 1920s. It had character, with its tall, arched windows and hardwood floors that creaked with every step. But it was cheap, and that's what sold me. I was young, broke, and just trying to make it on my own in the city. The landlord, a gruff older man named Mr. Walker, had mentioned that the building had a history, but he didn't go into details. He gave me a key, shook my hand, and that was that. The apartment itself was on the 3rd floor, a one-bedroom unit with peeling wallpaper and a fireplace that hadn't been used in years. It was small but cozy, and I quickly made it my own. For the first week, everything seemed normal. I unpacked my things, adjusted to the new surroundings, and went about my life as usual. But then, on the 8th night, something happened that I couldn't explain. I had been getting ready for bed, brushing my teeth in the bathroom, when I noticed something strange in the mirror. My reflection seemed slightly off. At first I couldn't put my finger on it. It was just a tiny detail, something that didn't feel right. I paused, wiping the fog off the mirror, trying to focus on the image in front of me. I had never been one to get caught up in superstitions or odd feelings, but this was different. My reflection, my own reflection, looked like it was moving slower than I was. When I turned my head to the left, my reflection seemed to follow a fraction of a second too late. When I raised my hand to adjust my hair, my reflection was still frozen in the position it had been in before. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I had never noticed anything like this before. I told myself it was nothing, just an odd trick of the light or maybe a weird angle in the mirror. But the more I watched, the more the discrepancy grew. My reflection wasn't just delayed, it was wrong. It looked like me, but it didn't feel like me. I stepped back, trying to dismiss the unsettling feeling in my chest. But then I saw something that made my heart stop. In the reflection, the figure of me, it smiled. A small, almost mocking smile. But I hadn't smiled, I was just staring wide-eyed and horrified at the strange figure in front of me. The smile was cold, sinister, and twisted. It wasn't my smile. It was something else. I blinked, and the reflection returned to normal, mimicking my movements exactly. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Shaken, I left the bathroom and tried to distract myself by watching TV. I chalked the incident up to stress or exhaustion. But as I sat there on the couch, I couldn't stop thinking about the smile. What was it? Why had the reflection smiled when I hadn't? The following night I went to bed early, hoping to put the strange experience behind me. But I didn't sleep well. I kept tossing and turning, my mind replaying the scene in the bathroom over and over. At one point I woke up to the sound of something faint, almost like a whisper. I sat up in bed, straining to hear it, but the apartment was silent, the only noise coming from the distant hum of traffic outside. I tried to ignore it, but then I heard it again, clearer this time. It was my name. A soft, breathy whisper, like someone was standing right next to my bed calling my name. Sophie. I froze, my heart racing. There was no one in my apartment, but the voice sounded so real, so close. I turned on the bedside lamp and scanned the room, my eyes darting from corner to corner. Nothing. Just shadows. The whisper stopped, and I convinced myself it was just a figment of my imagination. I was tired, and my mind was playing tricks on me, but the whispering continued, night after night, always calling my name in the same soft, seductive voice. The worst part was that every time I heard the voice, it seemed to be getting closer. The whispers would follow me around the apartment, creeping into my mind. I could feel them more now, could sense their presence like someone was standing just behind me, waiting for me to turn around. The real terror didn't start until the following week, when I had to go to work late one evening. I returned to the apartment at around 10 p.m., feeling exhausted. I threw my bag on the couch and walked into the bathroom to wash up. As I approached the mirror, I hesitated. I didn't want to see the reflection again, afraid of what it might do. But when I looked, I saw something that made my blood run cold. My reflection wasn't just delayed anymore. It was doing its own thing. It was moving completely independent of me. I could see myself standing frozen in front of the sink, but my reflection was pacing back and forth. It looked angry, restless, like it was trying to get out. It stopped, and for a moment we locked eyes. I felt a wave of coldness rush over me as I saw the reflection's face twist into something unrecognizable. It wasn't me anymore. It was a creature, a distorted version of me, its face contorted into a grotesque mask of rage. I couldn't move. I was frozen, my eyes fixed on the mirror as my reflection began to approach the glass. It reached out, its hand pressing against the surface, and I could feel a cold chill radiating from the mirror. I stumbled backward, heart pounding in my chest, and when I glanced back at the reflection, it was back to normal. It looked like me again, but the smile, oh, that smile, was back. It was the same mocking, evil grin from that first night. I ran out of the bathroom, panic flooding my body, and grabbed my phone. I called my best friend Rachel, hoping she would pick up. It rang several times before she finally answered, groggy and half asleep. I tried to explain what was happening, but my words came out in a frantic jumble. "There's something wrong with the reflection. It's not me. It's—" "Slow down, Sophie," Rachel said, her voice calm, but filled with concern. "Are you sure you're just not seeing things? It sounds like you're just really stressed." I knew she was trying to help, but it didn't make the terror I was feeling any less real. "I swear, Rachel, it's not me. It's something else, something in the mirror, and I don't know what it wants." She told me to stay calm and to try to get some sleep. I reluctantly agreed, though I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep a wink that night. The apartment felt suffocating, like it was closing in on me. The whispers started again, louder this time, echoing through the walls. My name, calling me, urging me to come closer, to look into the mirror. The next day I went to work, but I could barely concentrate. I was too terrified to go back to the apartment, knowing what awaited me there. That evening, when I returned home, I had the strange urge to go straight to the bathroom. I knew I shouldn't, but I couldn't resist. When I looked into the mirror, I expected the same twisted reflection to greet me, but this time, the mirror was empty. There was nothing. No reflection at all. I blinked, confused, but when I looked again, my reflection appeared. But it wasn't me. It was the same distorted version I had seen before, staring at me with that malevolent smile. "You shouldn't have looked," it whispered. The voice was cold, guttural, like it was coming from somewhere deep within the mirror. I backed away slowly, my breath coming in short gasps. The figure in the mirror didn't move. It just stared, watching me. I couldn't take it anymore. I packed up my things and left the apartment that night. I didn't care if I had nowhere else to go. The thought of staying in that place any longer, of looking into that mirror again, was enough to drive me to the brink of madness. To this day, I don't know what I saw in that mirror. Maybe it was a ghost, or maybe it was something worse. But I'll never go back to that apartment, and I'll never look into a mirror the same way again. Because some reflections aren't just reflections. They're something else entirely. And they might be waiting for you to look, to call you into the darkness. It was just another ordinary evening when I moved into the small rundown apartment on Hawthorne Avenue. After weeks of searching for a place that I could afford, this one came as a blessing. It was cheap, and although it was tucked away on the second floor of an old building, it had everything I needed: a bed, a kitchen, and a bathroom that still worked. The only downside was that it was in an area that felt a little too quiet, a bit too isolated, but for the price I didn't care. The landlord, Mrs. Langley, was an older woman with a soft, warm voice. She seemed kind, though there was something unsettling about her. Maybe it was the way she smiled just a little too much, or the way her eyes seemed to dart nervously whenever she spoke. I noticed that she didn't want me to ask too many questions about the building, especially about the other tenants. But I pushed it aside, figuring it was just my imagination getting the best of me. The first few nights in the apartment were uneventful. I unpacked my things, settled in, and got into a comfortable routine. I didn't know anyone in the neighborhood, and the silence of the apartment building made it easy to focus on work and relax. The walls were thin, and I could sometimes hear the neighbors, but nothing that would make me uncomfortable. That was until the 5th night. I was in bed, half asleep, when I heard the soft sound of footsteps in the hallway. It wasn't unusual for someone to walk by, but there was something about this particular sound that caught my attention. It was too slow, too deliberate. The footsteps echoed in the quiet hallway, soft thuds against the wooden floor, and it didn't sound like anyone was in a hurry. I strained my ears, listening intently. The footsteps stopped just outside my door. I sat up in bed wondering if I had imagined it. Maybe I had been dreaming. But then, I heard the unmistakable sound of a deep breath, followed by a soft exhale. It was so close that I could almost feel the breath on my skin. My heart raced as I froze, trying not to make a sound. I wanted to get up and open the door, to check if someone had been standing there, but something stopped me. A gut feeling, a sense that I wasn't supposed to know what was on the other side of the door. The breath came again, slow and deliberate, followed by the soft rustling of something shifting in place. I lay in the dark, holding my breath, waiting for whatever it was to go away. But it didn't. The footsteps started again, moving away from the door, down the hallway. I didn't hear a door open, and I didn't hear the elevator ding. It was just silence. Complete, eerie silence. The next day I decided it was just my nerves. The apartment was old after all. Maybe the building settled at night or the pipes creaked, making odd noises. But when I went to the kitchen that morning, I noticed something strange. The doorknob to my apartment was slightly turned, as if someone had been fiddling with it the night before. I froze, staring at the doorknob for several moments, wondering if I had somehow left it that way. But no, I was sure I hadn't. I chalked it up to my imagination again, but deep down I knew something wasn't right. That evening, as I sat on the couch watching TV, I felt an overwhelming sense of unease. The air in the apartment felt thick, like it was pressing in on me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The longer I sat there, the more the feeling intensified. It was as though eyes were on me, from somewhere in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. At around midnight, I went to bed, hoping a good night's sleep would clear my mind, but just as I was about to drift off, I heard the footsteps again. Soft, deliberate steps, the same slow pace as the night before. This time, they stopped directly in front of my bedroom door. I lay perfectly still, my heart thumping in my chest. The room was pitch dark, and all I could hear was my own breath, shaky and fast. I wanted to scream, but the words caught in my throat. I wanted to move, to run, but my body wouldn't respond. It was like I was frozen in place, paralyzed with fear. Then I heard it. A whisper. It was so quiet that I almost didn't catch it, but it was there, just loud enough for me to hear. "Let me in." The voice was raspy, as if it came from a throat that hadn't spoken in years. The hairs on my neck stood up, and a cold sweat broke out across my skin. I wanted to call out, to shout, to do something, but I couldn't. I was trapped in that frozen moment, unable to move. The whisper came again, louder this time. "Let me in." I was terrified. Who was outside my door? Was it one of the neighbors, or was something far worse standing there waiting for an invitation? I didn't know what to do. Should I open the door? Should I call the police? My mind raced with possibilities, but nothing made sense, and then the most horrifying part happened. The door handle turned. slowly, creaking with every movement like someone was trying to get in. I held my breath, my hands shaking. There was no way I was opening that door. I couldn't. Whatever was on the other side, whatever had whispered to me, was not something I wanted to face. The handle continued to turn as though testing my resolve. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the sound stopped. The handle was still. The footsteps faded away and the hallway fell silent once more. For the rest of the night, I didn't sleep. I sat in bed wide-eyed, staring at the door, praying that whatever it was would leave me alone. I didn't dare leave my room. I didn't even dare to breathe too loudly, afraid that the thing outside my door would hear me. The next morning I woke up exhausted, my nerves frayed from the lack of sleep. I needed to get out of the apartment to clear my head. I took a walk around the block, trying to distract myself from the fear gnawing at my mind. When I returned, I found a small envelope slipped under my door. It had no return address, just my name written in shaky handwriting. I opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside, there was a single sheet of paper, folded neatly. I unfolded it and read the words that were scrawled across the page. "I see you." The words sent a wave of cold terror through me. Who was watching me? Who knew what I had heard? My mind raced, but I couldn't find an explanation. I immediately checked the locks on the door, double-checking that everything was secure. Then I checked the windows. I couldn't shake the feeling that something, was watching me from the shadows. That night, I decided I would confront whatever was haunting me. I couldn't live like this anymore. I needed answers. So, as midnight approached, I waited. I sat on the couch, staring at the door, waiting for the footsteps, the whispers, the feeling of being watched. And sure enough, right on cue, they returned. The footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoed through the hallway. The same soft breath, the same whisper. "Let me in." I didn't move. I didn't say a word. I stayed as still as possible, waiting. The footsteps stopped in front of my door again. I could hear them breathing, waiting for me to react. But I stayed silent. I wouldn't give in. I wouldn't let whatever it was have power over me. Then, just as quickly as it started, the presence seemed to vanish. The door handle turned, but the footsteps faded away. I waited for what felt like an eternity, but nothing happened. I slowly stood up, inching toward the door, heart racing. When I looked through the peephole, I saw nothing. The hallway was empty, but I could feel it. The presence was still there, just beyond the door, waiting for me to make the wrong move. I don't know what it was, or what it wanted, but that night, I packed up my things and left. I never looked back. I'd been living in the same house for over a year when the first voice came. At first I thought it was just the house settling, the creaks and groans that old homes are known for. I'd heard rumors about the house being a little strange, but I didn't believe in that kind of thing. I thought ghosts were just stories people told to spook each other, like the ones you hear around campfires. But everything changed the night I heard that voice. It was late, just after midnight, when I was lying in bed. The house was completely quiet, save for the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the occasional car passing by outside. I had just started to doze off when I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper. It came from somewhere behind me, just beyond my bedroom wall. At first I thought I had imagined it, but then it came again, clearer this time. "Help me." It was a voice, quiet and fragile, like someone was in pain. I sat up in bed, straining to hear. The house was still. I convinced myself it was just the wind or some other noise outside, but the voice didn't stop. It came again, louder this time. "Please, help me." My heart pounded in my chest as I stood up, looking around my bedroom, expecting to see someone standing there. But there was no one. No one in the room, just the shadows stretching across the walls. I walked cautiously toward the door, convinced I was hearing things. The voice sounded so real, so close. I reached for the door handle, my hand trembling, but just as I was about to open it, the voice came again, closer this time. Please. Don't leave me. I froze. The voice was coming from inside the wall as if someone was trapped in there, pleading for help. But how could that be? I lived alone. The house had been empty for years before I moved in. I hadn't heard anything unusual until now. I didn't know what to do. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over me, but I couldn't just ignore it. The voice sounded so desperate, so real. It wasn't just the wind or the house settling. I was sure of it now. Something was in those walls. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, half expecting the voice to stop, but it didn't. The whispering continued, growing more urgent, more frantic. The dispatcher answered after a few rings. 1. What's your emergency? I swallowed hard, my throat dry. There's someone in my walls. They're asking for help. They keep saying, help me. There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. The dispatcher seemed to think I was joking. Ma'am, is this a prank? No, I nearly shouted. Please, you have to send someone. I don't know what it is, but there's something in my walls and it's begging me for help. The dispatcher sighed. I'm sending someone over to check it out, but I need you to stay calm. It's probably just a pipe making strange noises or something. But I knew it wasn't. The voice was too real, too human. I hung up and paced around the room, my nerves shot. I couldn't stop hearing the whispers, even when I tried to block them out. It was like they were seeping into my mind, echoing through the walls and through my own thoughts. They wouldn't stop. Minutes later, I heard a knock at the door. I rushed to open it, relieved to see 2 police officers standing on my front porch. One of them, a tall man with a stern face, stepped forward. Ma'am, we received your call. Can you tell us what's going on? I explained the situation, trying to keep my voice steady. There's something in the walls. I keep hearing it. It sounds like someone is trapped. It's asking for help. The officers exchanged skeptical looks but agreed to check it out. I led them into the living room, where the whispering had started. The house was quiet now, eerily still. It almost felt like the voices had gone, but I could still hear them faintly in the back of my mind. The officers inspected the walls, tapping gently with their knuckles, trying to figure out where the sound was coming from. After a few minutes, one of them turned to me, shaking his head. Ma'am, there's nothing here. We can't hear anything out of the ordinary. We've checked the plumbing and there's no sign of anything that could be causing these noises. It's probably just a draft or something. I felt a wave of frustration. But you don't understand. It was real. The voice. Whoever it is, they're still in there. I'm not crazy. The officers looked at each other, clearly unsure of what to do. One of them put his hand on my shoulder. I think you're just a little rattled, ma'am. It's late, and you've been alone in the house for a while. Maybe you're just hearing things. If you're feeling unsafe, we can stay for a little while longer. But it's likely nothing. I wanted to argue, but the words caught in my throat. The officers left shortly after, leaving me feeling even more isolated. I stood in the center of my living room, staring at the walls, knowing something was still there, waiting. That night, I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear the whispers, soft, pleading, desperate. Help me. Please. Don't leave me. The voice was growing more and more frantic, and it seemed to be coming from every corner of the house now, not just the walls. It felt like it was inside my head. I tried to ignore it, but the whispers wouldn't stop. Every time I moved, every time I went to the kitchen or the bathroom, I could feel something behind me, breathing down my neck, following me. It was like the house itself was alive, and the voice was its heartbeat. The next day, I called a contractor to come inspect the house, hoping that maybe something in the walls was malfunctioning, some kind of machinery causing the noise. He arrived in the afternoon carrying a set of tools. He was a middle-aged man with a deep voice and a calm demeanor. He started by tapping the walls and listening for anything unusual. For a while, there was nothing, just silence. But then, as he moved to the far wall of the living room, he stopped and looked at me with a puzzled expression. "I think I hear something," he said, his voice low. "It's faint, but there's definitely a sound coming from behind here." I felt my stomach drop. "What is it?" The contractor looked uneasy. "I don't know. It sounds like something scratching, almost like nails against wood." I couldn't breathe. The voice had stopped, but now there was this new sound, this scraping. It was like someone, was trying to break through from the other side of the wall. He grabbed his tools and started prying at the drywall, pulling it back piece by piece. I stood there trembling, not sure whether to run or to stay. What would we find? Would it be a person or something else? The wall cracked open, and the contractor pulled a chunk of drywall aside. I gasped when I saw what was behind it. There was nothing there. No person, no creature. Just a hollow space inside the wall. But then from that empty space came the sound again. "Help me." I froze. It was the voice. It was coming from the wall. But it wasn't just a whisper anymore. It was a scream, a wail of pure desperation. The contractor jumped back, his eyes wide with shock. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Did you hear it?" He didn't answer. He just stared at the hole in the wall, his face pale, his mouth moving as if he was trying to form words. The voice came again, louder this time. "Please, help me." We both backed away slowly, and the contractor rushed to cover the hole, as though trying to block whatever was inside from escaping. "Get out," he muttered. "Get out of here now." I didn't need to be told twice. I ran out of the house, my heart pounding in my chest, and didn't stop until I was far away, standing in the middle of the street. The voice was still echoing in my head, but I could no longer hear it in the walls. The house was silent once more. I haven't returned to the house since that day. I don't know what it was that I heard, or who, or what, was trapped in those walls. But I can't shake the feeling that something is still waiting in there. Something that won't stop calling for help. It was the type of night that makes you feel like something isn't quite right, even when everything seems normal. A soft breeze blew through the cracked window, and the sound of crickets chirping filled the air. My apartment was the last on the hallway, tucked away at the end of a narrow corridor. It was quiet most of the time, which I liked. Peaceful, undisturbed. I'd just moved in a month ago, and so far everything had been fine. That night I was sitting on the couch in my living room, scrolling through my phone and trying to finish a few things before heading to bed. It was nearly 1 a.m., and the building was silent. The occasional creak of the floorboards or the sound of someone walking down the hall was all I could hear. I didn't mind the solitude, in fact I preferred it. I don't know exactly when it started, but at some point I became aware of a feeling that had settled over the room, a heaviness in the air that made my skin crawl. It wasn't a sudden fear, just a slow, creeping unease that made my heart beat a little faster than normal. It was like being watched, but when I looked around, no one was there. The silence became almost oppressive. My phone buzzed in my hand, breaking the stillness. It was a text from my friend Rachel. "Hey, you still up?" I quickly typed back, feeling a slight relief from the distraction. "Yeah, just finishing up some work." "Why?" "Just wanted to check in. Been a while since we hung out." I chuckled and texted back. "We'll hang out soon, I promise. Just need to finish this first." I went back to the task at hand, trying to push aside the growing sense of dread. It wasn't normal to feel this way in your own apartment, and I was trying hard to shake it off. As I worked, I glanced toward the hallway at the far end of the room. It was a long, dimly lit stretch of space that led to my bedroom, with a few closed doors to other apartments. The hallway light was out, and all I could see was a faint outline of the door to my room. And then I saw it. At first, it was nothing more than a shadow. A dark shape at the end of the hall, standing still in the corner. I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me, some sort of optical illusion created by the dim light. But as I looked closer, the shadow moved. It was slow at first, like someone stepping forward. My heart skipped a beat. I blinked a few times, hoping that I was just tired or imagining it, but no. The shadow was still there, and it was getting closer. I felt my breath catch in my throat. The shadow wasn't just moving, it was taking form, shifting into a shape I could barely make out. A figure, tall and broad, standing at the end of the hallway. For a moment it stood still again, and then, without warning, it took a slow step toward me. I wanted to move, to get up and bolt out the door, but my body wouldn't respond. My eyes stayed glued to the figure as it crept forward step by step. I couldn't tell if it was a person or something else, but the closer it came, the more I could feel its presence. I didn't dare make a sound. I sat frozen on the couch, my heart pounding in my chest as the figure drew nearer. It was no longer just a shadow. It was a man, tall and thin, with an unsettling presence that made every muscle in my body tense. The closer he got, the more I could make out. His movements were deliberate, slow, and unnerving. His face was hidden in shadow, and he didn't seem to be in any hurry. The air grew colder, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I knew without a doubt that something was wrong. The man paused at the edge of the living room, just out of reach of the light from the hallway. I still couldn't make out his face, but I could feel his gaze. It was as if he was staring directly at me, even though I couldn't see his eyes. The silence between us was unbearable. I wanted to scream, to shout, to do anything to break the tension, but I couldn't. My mouth was dry, and the only sound I could hear was my heart, thudding in my chest. And then, in the most terrifying way possible, the man smiled. It wasn't a real smile, but something colder, something sinister. His lips stretched too wide, exposing teeth that looked like they didn't belong to a person. It wasn't a smile of warmth or friendliness. It was something dark and predatory. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Instead, there was a low, guttural growl, like a sound made by an animal. The hairs on my arms stood on end as the sound reverberated in my chest, deep and menacing. Without thinking, I bolted from the couch and ran to the door. I tried to twist the handle, but it wouldn't open. It was locked. My mind raced as I fumbled with the lock, my fingers shaking violently. The man's growl grew louder, more menacing, and I could feel the air in the room thickening. I managed to unlock the door and threw it open, stumbling into the hallway. My apartment was on the second floor, and the only way out was through the building's main door, which was at the other end of the hallway. I ran toward it, my footsteps echoing loudly in the silence. I heard the man's footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate, matching my pace. The door was just ahead, but my legs felt like they were made of lead, and every step I took felt like it took more effort than the last. I reached for the handle, praying that it wouldn't be locked too. To my relief, it turned easily, and I pulled the door open, bursting out into the cold night air. I didn't stop running until I reached the street, and even then I didn't feel safe. My breath came in ragged gasps, and my body shook uncontrollably. I couldn't believe what had just happened. Had I imagined it? Was it a nightmare? I don't know how long I stood there staring back at the building, but eventually I realized that the man wasn't following me. There was no sign of him in the doorway, no shadow lurking at the windows. It was like he had vanished. I didn't return to the apartment that night. I called a friend to stay with her, and the next day, I packed up my things and moved out. The landlord had no answers. She said no one had complained about anything strange happening in the building before, but I knew what I had seen, and I knew I could never go back. To this day, I don't know who or what that man was. Sometimes when I walk past that building on my way to work, I feel a chill run down my spine, and I can't help but glance up at the windows. Every now and then, I think I see something, someone, standing there in the dark, waiting. But I don't stop to look. I keep walking, and I never look back. It was supposed to be an ordinary Friday night. I had just finished a long week at work and was looking forward to a quiet evening at home. My small apartment wasn't much, but it was cozy, and I'd grown to love the solitude it offered. My plans were simple: watch a few episodes of my favorite show, order some takeout, and maybe fall asleep on the couch. The evening started as planned. By 11 p.m., I was sprawled out on the couch, half a carton of lo mein sitting on the coffee table, and the TV playing some mindless sitcom in the background. Outside, the wind was picking up, rattling the windows. It was one of those blustery nights where the air felt electric, the kind that made you want to curl up under a blanket and forget the outside world existed. By midnight, I was starting to doze off. The television's soft glow lit up the room, and the sound of canned laughter echoed faintly. I was somewhere between awake and asleep when I heard it. A knock. It was faint at first, just a single, soft tap, tap, tap that I thought I might have imagined. My eyes fluttered open and I glanced at the door, expecting to see nothing. My apartment was on the third floor of a quiet building, and visitors were rare, especially this late at night. Still, I muted the TV and listened. For a moment, all I could hear was the wind howling outside and the faint hum of my refrigerator. Then there it was again. Tap, tap, tap. This time it was louder, more deliberate, like someone was trying to get my attention. I sat up, my heart starting to race. Who would be knocking at this hour? My friends knew better than to show up unannounced, and I hadn't ordered anything that late. I walked slowly to the door, my bare feet silent on the carpet. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. No answer. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Something about the knock felt wrong. It wasn't the kind of knock you'd expect from a neighbor or a delivery driver. It was too slow, too measured, almost like whoever was on the other side wasn't in any hurry. I peered through the peephole, expecting to see someone standing there, but the hallway was empty. The dim light from the overhead fixtures cast long shadows, but there was no sign of anyone. My stomach knotted. I stood there for a moment, staring into the empty hallway, before stepping back and locking the deadbolt. Probably just the wind, I muttered to myself, trying to shake the unease that was creeping up my spine. But deep down I didn't believe it. The knock had been too deliberate, too human. I returned to the couch, but I couldn't relax. I kept glancing toward the door, waiting for the knock to come again. Minutes passed, and just when I was starting to convince myself it was nothing, it came again. Tap, tap, tap. This time it was louder, more insistent. My breath hitched as I stared at the door. I didn't move, hoping whoever it was would just go away. But the knocking didn't stop. It came again, louder and more forceful. "Who's there?" I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. No response. I grabbed my phone and dialed the building's security office. The guard, an older man named Hank, answered after a few rings. "Hey, Hank. It's me, Sarah in 3B. I think someone's knocking on my door. Can you check the cameras?" There was a pause before Hank replied. "I'm looking now. Hold on." I waited, my heart pounding in my chest. "Sarah, there's no one there," Hank said after a moment. "The hallway's empty." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Are you sure? I swear I heard someone knocking." "I'm sure," Hank replied. "Maybe it's just the wind. These old buildings make all kinds of noises." I thanked him and hung up, but I didn't feel any better. Something about this didn't feel right. I locked the door, double-checking both the deadbolt and the chain, and decided to try and sleep in my bedroom. The hallway outside my room was dark, the only light coming from the small lamp on my bedside table. I climbed into bed, pulling the blankets up to my chin, and tried to push the strange knocking out of my mind. But as soon as I closed my eyes, it started again. Tap, tap, tap. This time it wasn't coming from the front door. It was coming from the window. My blood ran cold. My bedroom was on the third floor. There was no way anyone could be outside my window. Slowly I turned my head toward the sound. The curtains were drawn, but I could see the faint outline of something pressed against the glass, something moving. I didn't dare get up. My phone was still in my hand, and I dialed 911, my fingers trembling so badly I could barely hit the buttons. "1, what's your emergency?" "There's someone outside my window," I whispered, my voice shaking. "I live on the third floor. They're knocking." The dispatcher's voice was calm and professional. "Stay on the line with me. Officers are on their way. Are you in a safe place? I don't know, I said, my voice barely audible. I don't think they can get in, but before I could finish, the knocking stopped. The silence was deafening, and I felt a momentary sense of relief. Maybe whoever it was had given up. But then I heard something far worse, the sound of the window sliding open. I bolted upright, my heart hammering in my chest. The curtains fluttered as a cold gust of wind blew into the room. I couldn't see who, or what, was there, but I could feel it. The air felt heavy, oppressive, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. The dispatcher was still on the line, her voice a distant hum as I stared at the open window. And then I saw it. A hand. Pale and thin, it gripped the edge of the window frame, pulling the rest of the figure inside. It was tall, impossibly so, with long, gangly limbs and a face that didn't look quite human. Its eyes were sunken, its mouth twisted into a grotesque smile that sent a wave of terror through me. I screamed, dropping the phone and scrambling backward until I hit the wall. The creature tilted its head, its movements unnaturally jerky, like a marionette being controlled by invisible strings. It didn't speak, but its smile widened as it stepped closer. The only thought in my mind was to get out. I lunged for the door, yanking it open and sprinting into the hallway. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see if it was following me. The building was eerily quiet as I ran down the stairs, my bare feet slapping against the cold concrete. When I reached the lobby, Hank was there, looking startled as I burst through the door. "Sarah, what's going on?" he asked, but I couldn't form the words. I just pointed toward the stairs, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. The police arrived a few minutes later, and I told them everything. They searched the apartment, but there was no sign of anyone or anything having been there. The window was closed and locked just as I had left it. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed with a friend, too afraid to go back. A few days later, I moved out, leaving the apartment and its strange knocking behind. But even now, in my new place, I sometimes hear it. Late at night, when the wind is howling and the world is quiet, I hear the same slow, deliberate tap, 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 and I know deep down that it's not over. When I first moved to the countryside, I was seeking peace. After years of living in the city, surrounded by the constant noise of traffic and the suffocating press of humanity, I craved solitude. The old farmhouse I found was perfect. It was secluded, surrounded by acres of rolling fields and dense woods, and the closest neighbor was a mile away. For the first few weeks, the quiet was blissful, almost intoxicating. I spent my days tending to the small garden, reading on the porch and watching the sun set over the fields. But the nights were a different story. The first time I felt uneasy was about a month after I moved in. It was a chilly autumn evening, and the wind was howling outside. I was curled up in the living room with a book, the only light coming from the lamp beside me. The farmhouse was old, and it groaned and creaked with every gust of wind. At first, I thought the noises were just the house settling, but as the night wore on, I started to notice something strange. It sounded like footsteps. They were faint at first, almost imperceptible, as though someone were walking through the tall grass in the field outside. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was probably just the wind rustling the grass. But the sound didn't stop. It grew louder, more deliberate, until I was certain it wasn't the wind. Someone, or something, was out there. I put my book down and got up, peering out the window. The field stretched out in front of the house, bathed in the pale light of the moon. I squinted, trying to see if anyone was out there, but all I could make out were the swaying grasses. Still, the sound persisted, a steady crunching that seemed to be moving closer. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer maybe, or a coyote, but as I stood there staring into the field, I saw it, a figure. It was far off, barely visible in the moonlight, but it was there. Tall and thin, it stood perfectly still, facing the house. My breath caught in my throat as I watched it, waiting for it to move. For a long moment, nothing happened. The figure just stood there, unmoving, as though it were watching me. I felt a chill run down my spine. My logical mind tried to make sense of it. Maybe it was a scarecrow or some trick of the light. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. The figure was too solid, too real. I closed the curtains and turned off the lamp, plunging the room into darkness. My heart was pounding in my chest as I stood there listening. The footsteps had stopped, but the house was so silent now that I could hear my own breathing. I waited, straining to hear anything, but the only sound was the wind outside. Eventually, I convinced myself that I was imagining things. I locked the doors, double-checked the windows, and went to bed. But I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up, certain I'd heard something, a creak, a thud, the sound of footsteps on the porch. Each time I lay frozen in bed, too afraid to move. The next morning I went outside to look around. The field was empty, and there were no signs that anyone had been there. No footprints, no trampled grass. I felt a wave of relief, convincing myself that I'd let my imagination get the better of me. But the next night it happened again. I was in the kitchen washing dishes after dinner when I heard it. The faint sound of footsteps in the field. My stomach knotted as I turned off the faucet and stood there listening. The sound was unmistakable now, a slow, deliberate crunching that sent a shiver down my spine. I grabbed a flashlight and went to the front door, hesitating for a moment before stepping outside. The night was cool, and the air smelled of damp earth. I shone the flashlight across the field, the beam cutting through the darkness. At first I didn't see anything, but then the light caught something, movement at the edge of the field. The figure was there again, standing just beyond the reach of the flashlight. It was closer this time, its outline more distinct. I couldn't make out any details, but I could tell it was tall, much taller than a normal person. It stood completely still, facing me. I felt a surge of fear and anger. "Who's out there?" I shouted, my voice echoing across the field. The figure didn't move. I took a step forward, shining the flashlight directly at it, but the light didn't seem to touch it. It was as though the figure absorbed the light, its edges blurring and shifting in a way that made my stomach churn. I backed away, my hands shaking as I fumbled to unlock the door. Once inside, I bolted it shut and pulled the curtains closed. My heart was racing, and I could feel the cold sweat on my skin. I didn't know what was out there, but I knew I didn't want to find out. That night I didn't sleep at all. I sat in the living room with every light in the house turned on, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline. The footsteps continued, circling the house, coming closer and then fading away. I thought I heard tapping on the windows at one point, but I was too terrified to look. The days that followed were a blur. I avoided going outside after dark, and I kept the curtains drawn at all times. I started hearing strange noises during the day as well, soft whispers that seemed to come from the walls, faint knocking that echoed through the house. I felt like I was being watched constantly, even when I was alone. The final night in that house was the worst. It was just past midnight when the knocking started. It was loud and insistent, coming from the front door. My stomach turned as I stared at the door, frozen in place. The knocking grew louder, more frantic, until it sounded like someone was pounding with their fists. I grabbed the flashlight and crept toward the door, my heart hammering in my chest. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. The pounding stopped. For a moment there was silence. Then, from the other side of the door, I heard a voice. "Let me in." It was low and guttural, almost inhuman. My blood ran cold as the voice came again, more insistent this time. "Let me in." I stumbled backward, dropping the flashlight. The pounding started again, shaking the door in its frame. I ran to the bedroom, slamming the door shut and locking it behind me. I could hear the pounding echoing through the house, growing louder and louder. Then it stopped. I held my breath, straining to hear. The silence was deafening, and for a moment I thought it was over. But then I heard it, a scraping sound, like nails on wood, coming from the bedroom window. I turned, my eyes wide with terror as I saw it. The figure was there, its face pressed against the glass. Its eyes were hollow. its mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. It raised one long, bony finger and tapped on the window. I don't remember much after that. I must have blacked out because the next thing I knew, it was morning. The sunlight streamed through the window, and the figure was gone. I packed my things and left that day, leaving the farmhouse and the figure behind. I don't know what it was, and I don't want to know. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear it. The faint sound of footsteps in the field, growing closer and closer. When I moved into my new apartment, I was thrilled. It was an old Victorian-style building with high ceilings, wooden floors, and a charm that modern places just couldn't match. It was affordable, too, though the landlord had been oddly insistent that I read the lease carefully before signing. At the time, I didn't think much of it. All I wanted was my own space, and this place felt perfect. The only downside was the basement. It was a shared space for tenants to store things, but it gave me the creeps from the moment I first saw it. The stairs leading down were steep and narrow, and the air smelled damp and metallic, like rust and mildew. The single bulb hanging from the ceiling barely lit the room, casting long shadows that seemed to dance whenever the light swayed. Still, I didn't plan on spending much time down there. I shoved a few boxes into the corner, locked my storage cage, and hurried back upstairs. For the first month, everything was great. I settled into my new routine, enjoying the quiet and solitude the apartment offered. Then, one night, everything changed. It started with a sound. I was sitting on my couch, watching a movie, when I heard it. A faint scraping noise, like metal against concrete. At first I thought it was coming from outside, but when I muted the TV, I realized it was coming from below. The basement. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was probably just a pipe or some other old building quirk. But the noise didn't stop. It grew louder, more deliberate, until it sounded like someone dragging something heavy across the floor. My stomach tightened as I stared at the floor, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. Grabbing my phone and a flashlight, I headed for the basement door. The hallway was silent, the only sound my own footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. When I reached the door, I hesitated. The scraping had stopped, and the sudden silence was almost worse. I opened the door and peered down the stairs. The light at the bottom flickered weakly, casting strange, shifting shadows. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing in the confined space. No answer. I descended the stairs slowly, my flashlight cutting through the gloom. The basement was just as I remembered, cold, damp, and filled with the smell of decay. My storage cage was in the far corner, and as I approached, I noticed something strange. The door to my cage was slightly ajar. I froze, my heart pounding. I was sure I'd locked it. Slowly, I moved closer, shining the flashlight into the cage. My boxes had been moved, their contents spilled onto the floor. It looked like someone had rifled through them, but that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the writing on the wall. Scrawled in what looked like ash or charcoal were 3 words: "I see you." A chill ran down my spine as I backed away, my flashlight shaking in my hand. I turned, ready to bolt up the stairs, but then I heard it, the sound of breathing. Deep, raspy, and coming from the far corner of the basement. I swung the flashlight toward the sound, and for a moment I saw it. A shadow, darker than the surrounding darkness, crouched low to the ground. Its shape was wrong. Elongated limbs, a hunched back, and glowing eyes that seemed to pierce through the blackness. It moved, shifting unnaturally, and I felt a primal terror grip me. I didn't wait to see more. I turned and sprinted up the stairs, slamming the door behind me and locking it. My chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath, my mind racing. What had I just seen? Was it a person? An animal? Something else? I called the landlord the next morning, demanding to know if anyone else had access to the basement. He seemed oddly calm, almost dismissive. "It's an old building," he said. "Sometimes you hear things. Just keep the basement locked and you'll be fine." His response didn't sit well with me, but I didn't press further. Instead, I decided to avoid the basement altogether. I didn't need anything down there that badly. but whatever was in the basement didn't stay there. A few nights later, I woke up to the sound of footsteps. They were faint, but unmistakable, echoing through the hallway outside my bedroom. I sat up in bed, my heart racing, and listened. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, and they were getting closer. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, pointing it toward the door. The footsteps stopped just outside. I held my breath, waiting, but nothing happened. After a few moments, I mustered the courage to get up and open the door. The hallway was empty. I checked every room in the apartment, but there was no sign of anyone. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, I barely slept. And the next morning, I found something that made my blood run cold. On the living room wall, written in the same dark, ashy substance as before, were the words, "I'm here." I called the landlord again, furious and terrified. This time, he seemed genuinely alarmed. "I'll send someone to check it out," he said, though I could tell he was holding something back. A maintenance worker came by later that day and inspected the apartment. He found nothing unusual, but when I mentioned the writing on the wall, his face paled. "You're not the first tenant to complain about strange things," he said quietly. "This building, it has a history." He wouldn't say more, but that night I decided to do some digging. I searched online for anything about the building's past, and what I found left me shaken. Years ago, before it was converted into apartments, the building had been a boarding house. One of the residents, a man named Henry Grayson, had been accused of multiple murders. He lured his victims to the basement, where he did unspeakable things. He was caught and executed, but rumors persisted that his spirit lingered, trapped in the place where he had committed his crimes. I didn't want to believe it, but everything I'd experienced pointed to one conclusion. Something evil was in this building, and it had set its sights on me. That night I decided to leave. I packed a bag and planned to stay with a friend until I could find a new place. As I was grabbing my things, I heard it again. The footsteps, louder this time, echoing through the apartment. They weren't coming from the hallway or the basement. They were inside my bedroom. I froze, my heart pounding as I stared at the closed door. Slowly, the doorknob began to turn, and the door creaked open. Standing in the doorway was the shadowy figure, its glowing eyes locked on mine. It didn't move, but the air around it felt heavy, suffocating. I backed away, clutching my bag, and bolted for the front door. The figure didn't follow, but I could feel its presence, watching me as I fled. I never went back to that apartment. I hired movers to pack the rest of my things, and I stayed with friends until I found a new place. To this day, I don't know what I encountered in that building, but I still have nightmares about it. Sometimes when I'm alone at night, I think I hear the faint sound of footsteps, and I wonder if it followed me. It was the summer of 2018, and I had just moved into a small isolated cabin in the mountains. I needed the solitude. Life had been chaotic, and I wanted time away from everything, away from people, the noise, the pressure. The cabin was rustic, tucked deep in the woods, and had been empty for years before I rented it. That should have been a red flag, but at the time, I was too eager for silence to care. The first few days were uneventful. I spent my time unpacking, hiking through the trails around the property, and enjoying the quiet. The nearest neighbor was about 5 miles away, and the only sounds at night were the chirping of crickets and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. I had no cell service out there, but the solitude was exactly what I'd been craving. The first time I felt uneasy was on the third night. I had just finished dinner and was sitting on the couch, reading a book, when I noticed it, the feeling of being watched. It was subtle at first, just a vague awareness that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I glanced at the windows, but the curtains were drawn, and I couldn't see anything outside. Still, the feeling didn't go away. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, that my mind was playing tricks on me. After all, I was alone in a new place, surrounded by woods. It was natural to feel a little on edge, right? But then I heard it, a faint tapping sound coming from the window near the kitchen. It was so quiet that I almost didn't notice it at first, but once I did, I couldn't ignore it. Tap, tap, tap. It was deliberate, rhythmic, as though someone or something was trying to get my attention. I froze, my book slipping from my hands. My heart was pounding in my chest as I stared at the drawn curtain. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. The tapping stopped. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the window, waiting for something to happen. But the night remained silent, save for the occasional creak of the cabin settling. Eventually, I convinced myself it was just a branch brushing against the glass. I was being ridiculous, letting my imagination run wild. But the next night, it happened again. This time, it started around midnight. I had just crawled into bed when I heard it, the same faint tapping coming from the bedroom window. My stomach twisted as I lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to ignore it. But the sound was persistent, growing louder, more insistent. Tap, tap, tap. I finally worked up the courage to sit up and look. The curtains were drawn, but I could see the outline of something on the other side of the glass. It was tall, its head almost brushing the top of the window, and it wasn't moving. I grabbed the flashlight I kept on the nightstand and shone it toward the window. The light hit the curtain, but the figure didn't flinch or move. My hand was shaking as I got out of bed and stepped closer, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I reached for the curtain, hesitating for a moment before yanking it open. There was nothing there. I shone the flashlight outside, the beam cutting through the darkness. But all I could see were the trees and the empty yard. My heart was racing as I pulled the curtain shut and locked the window. I didn't sleep at all that night, and the next morning I went outside to investigate. The ground beneath the window was soft from the recent rain, and I expected to find footprints, but there was nothing. No sign that anyone or anything had been there. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Over the next few days, the tapping became a nightly occurrence. It didn't matter which room I was in, the sound would follow me, always coming from the nearest window. Sometimes it was faint, like fingernails lightly brushing the glass. Other times it was loud and sharp, like someone pounding with their fist. And it wasn't just the tapping. I started hearing other noises too. Soft whispers that seemed to come from just outside the cabin, footsteps crunching through the underbrush, the sound of heavy breathing near the windows. Every time I worked up the courage to look, there was nothing there. One night, the tapping started earlier than usual, just after sunset. I was in the living room, and this time it came from the large bay window that faced the forest. I didn't even bother getting up. I was too tired, too scared. I just sat there, staring at the curtain, waiting for it to stop. But then the tapping changed. It wasn't random anymore. It was deliberate, like someone was trying to form a pattern. A knock, 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 followed by 2 taps, then another knock. It repeated over and over, like some kind of code. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my flashlight and stormed to the window, yanking the curtain open. For the first time, I saw it. A face. It was pale and distorted, almost human but not quite. Its eyes were too large, too dark, and they seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. Its mouth was twisted into a grin that stretched impossibly wide, revealing rows of sharp, yellow teeth. It was pressed against the glass, its hands leaving smudges as they clawed at the window. I screamed, stumbling backward and dropping the flashlight. The light flickered as it hit the floor, casting wild shadows across the room. When I looked up, the face was gone. I grabbed my car keys and bolted for the door, not even bothering to pack. I didn't care about my things. I just needed to get out of there. The air outside was cold and still, and the woods seemed darker than they should have been. I could feel eyes on me as I sprinted to my car, fumbling with the keys before finally unlocking the door. As I started the engine and turned on the headlights, I saw it again. The figure was standing at the edge of the woods, its face half hidden in shadow. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just watched as I peeled out of the driveway and sped down the dirt road. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest town, where I checked into a motel and spent the night huddled under the covers, too scared to sleep. The next morning, I called the landlord and told him I was leaving, that I didn't care about the lease or my deposit. He didn't sound surprised. "You're not the first," he said quietly. "That cabin's been empty for years because no one stays longer than a few weeks. People always say the same thing. They feel like they're being watched." I didn't ask for more details. I didn't want to know. I just wanted to forget. It's been years since I left that cabin, but I still can't shake the feeling that I brought something back with me. Sometimes late at night I hear faint tapping on my bedroom window, and when I look, there's nothing there. But I know it's watching. It's always watching. When I inherited my grandmother's house, I wasn't sure what to do with it. It was an old Victorian home in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by overgrown fields and dense woods. I hadn't been there since I was a child, and my memories of the place were hazy at best. Still, I needed a change, and the idea of getting away from the city was appealing. So I packed up my things and moved in, ready to start fresh. The house was in surprisingly good condition, considering how long it had been empty. The floors creaked, the walls were lined with faded wallpaper, and the air smelled faintly of dust and old wood. But it had a charm to it, a sense of history that made me feel connected to my grandmother in a way I hadn't in years. The first week was peaceful. I spent my days cleaning, unpacking, and exploring the house. There were rooms I didn't even remember, filled with old furniture and knickknacks that must have been there for decades. The attic in particular caught my attention. It was a large, dusty space filled with boxes, trunks, and old furniture covered in sheets. I didn't have the energy to go through it all, so I left it for another day. The nights, however, were different. The house had an eerie stillness after dark, the kind that made every little noise seem louder. I chalked it up to my nerves. It was an old house after all, and old houses made noise. At least that's what I told myself. But then the sound started. It was a Thursday night just after midnight when I heard it for the first time. A faint, rhythmic creaking coming from above. At first I thought it was the wind, or maybe the house settling. But as I lay in bed listening, I realized it was too regular. It sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving across the attic floor. I sat up, my heart racing. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, shining it around the room. Everything looked normal, but the sound didn't stop. It continued for several minutes before fading away, leaving me in silence. The next morning I went up to the attic to investigate. The air was thick with dust, and the sunlight streaming through the small window illuminated the cluttered space. I looked around, but there was no sign that anyone or anything had been up there. No footprints in the dust, no disturbed boxes. I convinced myself it had just been my imagination and went about my day. But the sounds didn't stop. Every night, around the same time, I'd hear the same slow, deliberate footsteps in the attic. Sometimes they'd last for minutes, sometimes just a few seconds, but they always came. I started to dread going to bed, knowing I'd be lying there, waiting for the noise to start. One night, I decided to confront whatever it was. I stayed up, sitting in the living room with a flashlight and a heavy wrench I'd found in the garage. When the creaking started, I climbed the stairs to the attic, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound stopped the moment I reached the door. I hesitated for a moment before pushing it open. The attic was dark, the only light coming from my flashlight. I swept the beam across the room, illuminating the cluttered space. Everything looked the same as before, untouched and undisturbed. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. "Is anyone there?" The only response was silence. I spent the next few minutes searching the attic, moving boxes and checking corners, but there was nothing. No sign of anyone or anything that could have made the noise. Frustrated and a little embarrassed, I went back downstairs, telling myself I was being ridiculous. But the next morning I found something that made my blood run cold. On the dusty floor of the attic near the center of the room were footprints. They were small, like those of a child, and they led from the far corner of the attic to the door. I knew they hadn't been there the day before. I called my friend Mark, who was a bit of a skeptic, but also the kind of guy who would drop everything to help. He came over that afternoon and I showed him the footprints. He laughed it off, saying it was probably just an animal. A raccoon or something, he said, though he didn't explain how a raccoon could leave human-shaped footprints. Still, he offered to stay the night with me, just to put my mind at ease. We set up sleeping bags in the living room and spent the evening watching movies and drinking beer. For the first time in days, I felt a little less on edge. But then, around midnight, the footsteps started. Mark and I froze, staring at the ceiling as the sound echoed through the house. It was louder this time, more deliberate, as though whatever it was wanted us to hear it. Mark grabbed a flashlight and motioned for me to follow him. We climbed the stairs together, the creaking growing louder with each step. When we reached the attic door, Mark pushed it open and shone the flashlight inside. The room was empty, just as it had been before. But then we heard it. Soft laughter, coming from the far corner of the attic. It was high-pitched, almost playful, but there was something about it that made my skin crawl. Mark swore under his breath and stepped forward, the flashlight beam shaking in his hand. "Who's there?" he demanded. The laughter stopped, replaced by a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the floor. Mark backed away, pulling me with him. We slammed the door shut and ran downstairs, locking it behind us. We didn't sleep that night. The footsteps continued, moving back and forth across the attic, punctuated by the occasional burst of laughter. By morning, Mark was as freaked out as I was. "You need to get out of here," he said. "Whatever's in this house, it's not normal." I called a paranormal investigator that day, desperate for answers. She arrived the following evening, a no-nonsense woman named Evelyn, who carried a bag full of equipment. She spent hours in the house taking readings and asking questions, but it wasn't until she went into the attic that things took a turn. I stayed downstairs while she worked, listening to her footsteps above. At one point she called out to me, her voice trembling. "You need to come up here." I climbed the stairs, my legs shaking, and found her standing in the center of the attic. She was holding a small porcelain doll I hadn't seen before. Its face was cracked, its eyes wide and staring, and it looked ancient. "This," she said, holding up the doll, "is the source." I stared at her, confused. "What do you mean?" She explained that objects could sometimes hold energy, especially if they had been involved in traumatic events. The doll, she said, had been here for decades, and whatever had happened in this house had left its mark on it. She offered to take the doll and cleanse it, but as soon as she said that, the attic door slammed shut behind us. The air grew cold, and the laughter started again, louder and more menacing than before. The doll seemed to vibrate in her hands, and she dropped it, shattering it on the floor. The laughter stopped, replaced by an ear-piercing scream that made my ears ring. The air grew warmer, and the attic felt lighter somehow. Evelyn picked up the pieces of the doll, placed them in her bag, and told me it was over. I moved out of the house a week later. I couldn't stay, not after everything that had happened. I sold the property, and as far as I know, no one has reported anything strange since. But sometimes, late at night, I hear faint laughter in the back of my mind, and I wonder if it ever really left. I never should have gone back to that cabin. It had been years since my family's last visit to the small remote getaway deep in the Appalachian woods. But when my mother suggested I take a solo trip there to clear my head, I reluctantly agreed. I'd been going through a rough patch, college stress, a bad breakup, the works, and I figured some time alone might help me reset. The cabin hadn't changed much since I last saw it as a kid. It was a simple, one-story structure with peeling paint and creaky wooden floors surrounded by dense forest. The nearest town was a good 30-minute drive, and there was no Wi-Fi or cell service. Just me, a stack of books, and the sounds of nature. The first day was uneventful. I spent most of it unpacking and getting reacquainted with the place. By nightfall, the crickets were in full chorus, and the cabin felt cozy in its isolation. I made dinner, lit a few candles for ambiance, and settled down with a book. Around midnight, I decided to call it a night. As I climbed into bed, I felt a strange uneasiness settle over me, but I brushed it off as nerves. It wasn't every day that I stayed completely alone in the middle of nowhere. I left a small lamp on in the corner of the room just in case. I woke up sometime after 2 a.m. to the sound of tapping. At first, I thought it was just the wind knocking a branch against the window. But as I lay there listening, I realized it was too rhythmic. 3 taps, a pause, then 3 more taps. It was deliberate. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. The sound was coming from the window across the room. The curtains were drawn, but the faint outline of something moving caught my eye. I froze, unsure of what to do. Was it an animal? A person? I mustered up the courage to speak. "Hello, who's there?" The tapping stopped. For a long moment there was silence. Then a voice, low, guttural, and barely more than a whisper, came from the other side of the glass. "Come outside." I felt a chill crawl up my spine. My instincts screamed at me to stay put, but curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand and approached the window. My hands were trembling as I pulled the curtain aside. Nothing. The yard was empty, bathed in the pale light of the moon. I shone the flashlight across the trees, but there was no sign of anyone, or anything, that could have made the sound. Feeling foolish, I locked the window and climbed back into bed, though sleep didn't come easily. The next morning I tried to convince myself it had been a dream. Maybe I'd been half asleep and imagined the whole thing. I spent the day hiking through the woods, enjoying the fresh air and trying to shake off the lingering unease. By the time the sun set, I felt a little more relaxed. That night, I decided to stay up late, hoping exhaustion would help me sleep better. I was in the living room, reading by the fireplace when I noticed it, a faint flickering light through the window. It was coming from the woods. I turned off the lamp and moved closer to the window, peering out into the darkness. The light was unmistakable, bobbing gently as if someone were walking through the trees with a lantern. My first thought was that it might be a hiker, but the nearest trail was miles away and no one had any reason to be out here this late. I watched the light for a few minutes, debating whether I should investigate. Finally, I grabbed my flashlight and jacket and stepped outside, the cool night air biting at my skin. The lantern light was still there, hovering in the distance. It didn't move as I approached, staying just far enough away to keep me intrigued. As I got closer, I realized something was off. The light wasn't coming from a lantern. It was too bright, too steady. It almost looked like a glowing orb, floating a few feet above the ground. I stopped in my tracks, suddenly aware of how quiet the woods had become. The usual sounds of crickets and rustling leaves were gone, replaced by an eerie silence. The light flickered, as if beckoning me closer. Against my better judgment, I took a few more steps, my flashlight trembling in my hand. That's when I saw them, shadows, darting between the trees. They were quick, almost too quick to follow, but I could feel their presence. I wasn't alone. A low hum began to fill the air, growing louder with each passing second. The light pulsed in time with the sound, casting strange, shifting shadows across the forest floor. Panic set in, and I turned to run back to the cabin, but the path was gone. The trees seemed closer together, their twisted branches forming an impenetrable wall around me. I was trapped. The light moved closer, its glow revealing more of the shadows. They weren't human. Their shapes were wrong. Elongated limbs, hunched backs, and faces that seemed to shift and melt like wax. They circled me, their movements synchronized with the pulsing light. One of them stepped forward, its hollow eyes locking onto mine. It raised a bony hand, pointing toward the cabin. "Go back," it rasped, its voice echoing unnaturally. Do not follow the light. I didn't need to be told twice. I sprinted through the trees, branches scratching at my face and arms. The hum grew fainter as I ran, and the light dimmed behind me. When I finally burst through the tree line and saw the cabin, relief washed over me like a tidal wave. I locked every door and window, barricading myself inside. The hum was gone, but I could still feel their presence watching from the woods. I stayed up all night, clutching the flashlight and listening for any sign of movement. When morning came, I packed my things and left. I didn't care about the rest of the week I had planned. I just wanted to get as far away as possible. As I drove down the dirt road, I glanced in the rearview mirror, and saw it one last time, the lantern light, flickering at the edge of the woods. I've never gone back to that cabin, and I don't plan to. Sometimes late at night I dream about the light and the shadows, and I wake up drenched in sweat. I don't know what I saw in those woods, and I don't want to know. But I'll never forget what they told me. Do not follow the light. It all started the first night I moved into the old house on the edge of town. I'd been searching for a place to live closer to my new job, and the house seemed perfect. Affordable rent, a decent-sized yard, and most importantly, peace and quiet. I didn't mind that it was a little isolated. In fact, I welcomed it. After years of apartment living, I was ready for some solitude. The house was a simple 2-bedroom cottage with creaky wooden floors and peeling wallpaper, but it had a charm to it that I couldn't resist. The landlord had mentioned it was old, built in the late 1800s, but reassured me it was in good shape. Just a bit of history, he had said with a smile. My first evening there was uneventful. I unpacked some boxes, cooked a quick dinner, and spent the rest of the night reading in the small living room. The house had an odd stillness to it, but I figured it was just because I wasn't used to being alone in such a quiet place. It was around midnight when I first heard it. The knock. 3 slow, deliberate knocks on the front door. I froze, my book slipping from my hands onto the floor. At first I thought I might have imagined it, but then it came again. 3 more knocks, evenly spaced, as though whoever was on the other side wanted to make sure I heard them. I got up slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. Peering through the window beside the door, I expected to see someone standing on the porch. But there was no one there. The porch was empty, and the dirt road leading up to the house was dark and still. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. "Is someone there?" Silence. I locked the door, double-checking that the deadbolt was secure, and retreated to my bedroom. I told myself it was probably just kids playing a prank or maybe an animal bumping against the door. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that lingered long after I climbed into bed. The next morning, I found no signs of anyone, or anything, on the porch. No footprints, no scratches, nothing. I laughed at myself for being so paranoid and went about my day, chalking it up to first-night jitters, but the knocking came again the next night. It was the same as before. 3 slow, deliberate knocks, followed by silence. This time I didn't bother opening the door. I sat frozen on the couch, clutching my phone, though I knew there was no cell service this far out. When the knocks didn't come a second time, I forced myself to go to bed, though I barely slept. By the 3rd night, I was beginning to dread the evening. I tried to distract myself with TV, but when the clock struck midnight, the knocks came again. 3, as always. This time, I decided to take action. Armed with a flashlight and a kitchen knife, I threw open the door and shone the light across the yard. Nothing. The yard was empty, the surrounding woods dark and foreboding. The air was cold and still, and the only sound was the distant hoot of an owl. I stood there for a long moment, my breath visible in the chilly air before retreating inside and locking the door. The pattern continued for the next few nights. The knocks always came at midnight, never earlier or later. I stopped opening the door, but the sound haunted me, filling me with a growing sense of dread. By the end of the week, I was at my wit's end. I was exhausted from lack of sleep and constantly on edge, jumping at every little noise. On the 7th night, something changed. The knocks came as usual, but this time they were followed by a voice. It was soft, almost a whisper, but unmistakably there. "Let me in." I felt my blood run cold. The voice was strange, neither male nor female, and it seemed to echo unnaturally, as though it wasn't coming from the other side of the door but from inside my own head. I didn't respond, too terrified to move. "Please," the voice said again, more insistent this time. "Let me in." I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, even though I knew it was pointless without service. The screen displayed "no signal," taunting me. I considered running out to my car and driving to town, but the thought of opening the door, even for a second, was unbearable. The voice continued, growing louder and more frantic. It repeated the same phrase over and over, each time sounding more distorted. Let me in. Let me in. Let me in. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I sat there for what felt like hours, too scared to move, until the first light of dawn began to creep through the windows. Only then did I feel brave enough to approach the door. There were scratches on the wood, deep gouges that hadn't been there the night before. My stomach turned as I stared at them, my mind racing. Whatever had been outside wasn't human. That day, I called the landlord and demanded to know if anyone else had experienced anything strange at the house. He was quiet for a long moment before finally admitting that the previous tenants had left abruptly after only a few months. They said the house was unsettling, he confessed, but they didn't go into detail. I decided to leave that same day. I packed up my belongings and loaded them into my car, not caring that I was abandoning the lease. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the house growing smaller in the distance. For a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing on the porch, but when I blinked, it was gone. I've never gone back to that house, and I never plan to. But sometimes, late at night, I hear knocks on my apartment door. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. And I wonder if it followed me.